Chapter 1028. All these sudden changes caused Dispat to be in a bit of a mess. This second lord was now in a bit of a mess. "Don't worry about them," a voice suddenly sounded in his ear. "Now, you should worry about your own problem." Dispat frowned. The scepter in his hand quickly rotated half a circle and suddenly touched himself. Like the other things that the scepter had touched before, Dispat's body also began to change into a steel material. The second lord was naturally not harming himself. He was brushing another layer of shield on himself. Moreover, after being tempered, his body was different from the other things touched by the scepter. He could still move freely like before. It was not very scientific, but it was very magical. In fact, his reaction was indeed quite timely, because at the same time that his body was tempered, a cluster of sparks burst out from his skin, accompanied by an ear-piercing, scratching sound. A long saber like a crescent moon appeared beside him out of thin air. The blade was like a slippery loach, coiling around Dispat's skin. Disgusting swordsmanship. The second lord's figure retreated quickly. He hated the feeling of being licked by the blade. However, as he moved, the scimitar first disappeared and then appeared beside his body like a shadow. For a moment, he could not see the opponent's attack method clearly. This was because Brock did not have a physical body at the moment. The Desert Elf Sound Warlock had completely hidden in sound. Only when he attacked would he turn his saber into a saber. His saber was as fast as the wind and as aggressive as the fire. Dispat, who was facing the attack, felt as if he was in a sandstorm. Up, down, left, right, in every direction, there were shadows of the saber swaying at every moment. What was even more surprising was that the weapon in his enemy's hand was so extraordinary. Although it was not at the level of a divine weapon, it was at least enchanted with sharpness, sturdiness, paralysis, poison, magic break, and more than a dozen other magic effects. Considering the difficulty of stacking multiple spells on top of each other, creating such a weapon would be comparable to creating a real divine artifact. The dense slashes had broken many layers of protective spells. If Dispat had not decisively tempered himself, the second lord body would have been bleeding by now. That's enough. It was obviously not Dispat's style to take a beating without fighting back. Seeing that it was difficult to use conventional methods to resist the enemy, he used his trump card. The mutated Bigby force field gushed out in all directions with his body as the center. Suddenly, it repelled all macroscopic and microscopic substances, including sand, dust, air, and so on, forming a small spherical vacuum around him. Sound could not be transmitted in a vacuum, and the Desert Elf Blatch's surprise attack was stopped in an instant. Not only that, but Dispat also waved his scepter fiercely. This strike did not seem to touch anything, but it still caused the air and dust on the surface of the vacuum ball to be tempered. Gotcha! Looking at the human-shaped fold on the surface of the vacuum sphere, when the tempered reaction occurred, Brock, who had turned into sound, was also affected and directly peeled off from sound form to its original form. Dispat roared excitedly. Order death! Finger of death! Phantom killer! As if it was free, the second lord cast more than 10 spells in one breath, all of which bombarded the human-shaped fold. Even so, he still felt a little uneasy. When the tempered vacuum sphere was crushed by the atmospheric pressure, he still reached out his claws. When he touched the powdery substance, he did not feel the touch of warm flesh and blood. Instead, he felt a wet and slippery touch from his fingertips. Dispat suddenly realized that the situation was not normal, but it was too late. The powdery substance that had been bombarded by his spells suddenly exploded. A large amount of viscous liquid, like liquid amber, covered his whole body. A tall figure in a black robe appeared behind Dispat out of thin air. The steampunk half-lich stretched out the arm of his mechanical artificial body and calmly chanted an activation spell. Ultimate secret technique, Amber Seal. When the spell took effect, the viscous liquid that covered Dispat's body instantly solidified and enveloped the incarnation of the Lord of Hell. Amber Seal was originally a powerful sealing spell developed by Sneyd to deal with the Lord of the Abyss, the Tyrant Worm. Later, after studying the secret technique used by the Grand Vader to imprison keys, he modified the magic amber summoned by this powerful spell into the artificial liquid that could seal a mutated dragon that was comparable to the Lord of the Abyss. An incarnation of the Lord of Hell was actually not much different from a demon lord or a mutated dragon. Since these two could be sealed, Sneyd believed that this spell could also be used to deal with Despot. As it turned out, his guess was correct. The desert elf, Brock, who had just attacked Despot, was actually just a bait. He had a magical item called the Escape Ruby on him. This kind of Escape Ruby existed in pairs. When Brock was in danger, the Escape Ruby on him would be activated and switch places with the other Escape Ruby that Sneyd and the others had hidden in the distance. Due to the unique material, they had to find two identical magic rubies, which led to the high cost of this magical item. Using the Escape Ruby to escape actually had a rather superior feature. Using it was much faster than using advanced transmission or portal spells. The scale of Perpetual Order never worried about money. Not only was Blatch wearing an Escape Ruby, but it was also not an ordinary one. There were two Escape Rubies that were exactly the same as the one he was wearing. Not only did it transfer Blatch to a safe place, but it also transferred the artificial amber bomb that was bound to the third Escape Ruby. The result was needless to say. Although Sneyd guessed that the second Lord of Hell might be able to escape with his own strength like keys, it would still take some time. During this time, no one said that they could not do anything to the second Lord of Hell. That's right. The scale of Perpetual Order never advocated one-on-one combat. Chapter 10:29. In fact, less than a second after Despot was hit, he had performed a phase transfer along with the amber seal that enveloped his body. The destination of the teleportation was a cauldron that was 3 or 4 stories high. It was the Ogre Voodoo, Dr. Peru's #1 production pot, which was specially used to make voodoo potions. This pot usually boiled all day long because it was responsible for supplying goods to Puwu's potion shop in Sigil City. And now, this pot was boiling a kind of medicine that looked like a thick brown soup. The medicinal liquid bubbled and bubbled. There was a special construct robot under the pot that checked the temperature of the electric furnace. Paru controlled a large stirring rod with a remote control and stirred continuously. The Ogre Voodoo Doctor was at least 500 yards away from the pot. There was a special ventilation and filtration magic array between the two that continuously absorbed the smoke rising from the #1 production pot and discharged it into the bottomless abyss. Apart from Paru, only the half-lich Sneyder and the various undead creatures he created, or the wondrous craftsman Shay and his construct assistants dared to come to this factory where the pot was placed. In a sense, only they were unafraid of the poison. The amount of poison that was brewed from that pot was simply too much. In order to crush his uncle's business, Puwu had almost monopolized the market share of the highly toxic potions in Sigil City, and almost all of these poisons were produced from the #1 production pot. Today, in order to take special care of Despot, the Lord of Hell, Puwu had specially taken out a set of potion formulas from his uncle's collection. The venom gland of a demon-hunting spider, the tentacle of a bodiless monster, the venomous fangs of an abyssal W-Iram, the crystal of a centipede's death spray, the fragment of a sorcerer's staff, the tongue of a 330-year-old four-armed bat demon from the Great Abyss, the fourth layer of the bottomless abyss, the bone growth of a death-eyed tyrant, and a complete scale of an aged, ancient hellfire dragon. According to Puwu's personal notes, the potion brewed from these ingredients would be unbelievably strong. Even he had to drink it in moderation when he tasted it, as the slightest mistake could lead to death. As Puwu was only immune to plant-based poisons and a small number of strange poisons, such complicated poisons were rarely sold in shops. Fortunately, the great engineer Shay had come up with a remote control system, and Paulu knew a special method of brewing voodoo poison, which allowed the potency of the poison to seep into the depths of the amber without affecting the amber sealing technique. Otherwise, even if they had such a potion formula, they would not be able to use it to entertain the Second Lord's avatar. Despot, he was immersed in the potion of the #1 production pot. It was not easy to observe him now. However, Snade, who was in charge of installing the ventilation and filtration arrays connected to the bottomless abyss, had placed a group of magic eyes and some clockwork scouts at the other end of the arrays. The smoke rising from the medicinal liquid in the cauldron was completely discharged into the territory of a secondary demon overlord. Who woos the Baylor with the Lord, the Baylor, a second Lord, fell to the ground, Baylor. Other than the Baylor, who was still alive due to its powerful strength, the other weaker demons had all died from the poison. The Tana demons were known to be immune to poison, but even they could not directly face such a terrifying poison, and it was only a small amount of potion vapor. It could be inferred how speechless Despot, who was immersed in the #1 production pot, was now. If he still had the strength to speak, his first sentence would probably be, "Do a good deed and be human." However, there was indeed no human in the group responsible for dealing with him. After re-entering the soul binding tower, Keys's golem avatar relied on its liquid metal characteristics to compress its volume to a few tenths of its original size. However, if he wanted to pass through smoothly, he had to rely on squeezing. After fusing with the true body of the flying insect lord, these passages more or less had a tendency to turn into flesh and blood. When Keys forcibly squeezed in, he would accidentally stimulate them, causing them to involuntarily convulse or contract. Because this golem avatar was his avatar, every time Keys took a step forward, he often had to experience the painful experience of exploding. Moreover, for some special reason, he could not use advanced teleportation. Fortunately, this two-way test did not last too long. After all, Keys had gone deep into the soul binding tower with the team before, and he still remembered the road to the House of Gold. After a short sprint, he arrived at his destination. He found that the House of Gold had changed into another appearance. The tall and spacious underground culvert had disappeared and was replaced by a scene like the stomach of a behemoth. The golden threads that were connected to the perfect soul prisms had been completely covered by flesh and blood. They were all vibrating rhythmically, as if they had been given life. The perfect soul prism that had been hanging on the gold thread had become a piece of frosted glass at this moment. It was no longer as glittering as before, and there was no sign of the brilliance of a life form that was similar to broken magic crystals at all. The floor of the House of Gold was covered with broken bones. Judging from the shape, most of them were left behind by the Tauren warriors, bugbears, and earth goblins that were enslaved by the wandering drow clans. Only a small number of bones looked like they were left behind by the dark elves. Their flesh and blood had been digested by Barzub, who had fused with the soul binding tower, leaving behind only bones that did not have much nutrition. However, it seemed that for some reason, the Lord of the Flying Insects did not pack up the souls of these monsters and take them away. In the arcane vision of Keys's golem avatar, the bones were all glowing with a fluorescent green light. Almost every one of them had become an undead skeleton. Is Barzub unable to take away the souls of these guys, or is he simply keeping them as guards? After thinking for a while, Keys was more inclined to the former. He knew that the Lord of the Flying Insects probably did not know that the broken magic crystal that was born before the soul binding tower had been reincarnated. Moreover, there was no need for Barzub to arrange for some skeletons to guard this House of Gold. In the face of a powerhouse that could go deep into the soul binding tower, such guards were not enough. Therefore, the reason for the birth of these skeletons was obvious. This should be the protection that the tower's spirit provided for itself. It seems that it has quite a firm control over its territory. Even Barzub, who had fused with the soul binding tower, could not do anything to it. Keys was thinking about how to make use of this opportunity. Chapter 10:30. That's a little calculating. Thanks to his observation of the Tower Genie and his speculation of its mentality, Keys was able to conclude that the Tower Genie was testing him from this doomsday graveyard. But it was understandable. The Tower Genie had successfully possessed Barzub, and it had deceived Barzub. If someone asked it to turn against Barzub now, it would be a little afraid. When Keys left the House of Gold, there were still some demons in the place. But when Barzab arrived, they were all crushed to death by the winged insect lord. The souls of the demons returned to the 9 prisons of Bader, and the souls of the demons were lucky enough to return to the abyss. The remaining souls were all the Taurens, drows, and bugbears. Striding into the House of Gold, which had accumulated a lot of dust in just one night, Keys's mystic golem avatar crushed the skull of an unknown Tauren with a crack. "Sorry, but you really shouldn't have appeared under my feet." Quest's steps didn't stop as he boldly walked towards the perfect soul prism that was covered in dust. Instead, his words were filled with provocation. As for the Minotaur's skull that had been crushed into pieces, it was no longer green in color and had turned deathly white. But the other skeletons beside it were even greener. The mystic golem walked step by step into the House of Gold, as if it was taking a stroll in the park. And the path it passed was covered with white bone powder and bone fragments, like a field of white thorns. However, on both sides of the path, the other skeletons that had absorbed the souls and the bones crushed by Keys were like grass that had been moistened by a drizzle, turning green. Not only that, as Keys got closer to the center of the House of Gold, the changes in the grass became more and more intense. The skeletons that were lying quietly on the ground and pretending to be dead now stood up of their own accord. They began to gather together, separating each other's skeletons and trying to knead each other's souls together. When these undead monsters began to gather together, the temperature of the entire House of Gold abruptly dropped by a lot. The tunnel connecting the cave to the outside world also emitted a strange whimper sound due to the influx of large amounts of air. Not long after, a horrifying humanoid undead made up of a few muscles, a large number of skeletons, and some mud stood in front of Keys. It had 4 thick tentacle-like arms, and each arm was made up of ribs. Its lower body was made up of the lower bodies of several arachnids. On the right side of its body were a large number of skeletons of arachnids and bugbears. These skeletons hung on its body like a beehive. On the left side of its body, there was a carefully selected skull of a minotaur. Its horns were prominent, and steam could be seen coming out of its nostrils from time to time. If one did not look carefully, they would think that it was a crooked head. It doesn't have an official skull? Looking at the mutated skeleton before him, Keys could not help but have a thought. The tower spirit that caused its birth doesn't seem to be as indifferent as it appears. It obviously holds a grudge against Xin for almost having its consciousness taken away. Otherwise, it would have given its creation a skull. Of course, not having a skull did not mean that it did not have intelligence. At the very least, it didn't matter to the undead creatures whether they had a head or not. The head was just a symbol. But it was also due to this that the undead creature that had transformed into a terrifying appearance and gathered nearly 100 souls didn't attack immediately when it stood in front of Quest Golem incarnation made of adamantine and mithril. If the enemy doesn't move, I won't move. Although it did not feel fear, it knew that if it attacked, it would only be a matter of time before it was torn into pieces. After all, the order given by its creator was to stall for time. If the Essence Golem didn't make a move, then it would be happy to stare at Quest. It would just accompany him to the end. Interesting little trick. Keys looked at the creature for a few seconds and saw through it from the inside out. With the unique perspective of the quantum observer, he even understood the fluctuation of the soul fire in the undead creature's body. In a sense, this was how the undead creatures thought. However, I'm in a hurry today. It's urgent to talk to your creator, so Keys scratched his head with his right index finger. The adamantium finger rubbed some flames on the outer wall of the furnace above his head. A gun barrel appeared on his left hand. The double-barreled short-barrel gun, called the Wailing, was the only gun Keys was familiar with. So with a thought, the golem transformed into a weapon that was the same shape as the Wailing, but it was proportionally larger. "I'm sorry," Keys said in embarrassment. At the same time, the fingers of the golem did not stop. It pulled the trigger after the large-sized Wailing was formed. Of course, although it had yet to evolve into an adult megalosaurus, our protagonist had lived in the multiverse for almost 100 years. He was not the kind of young man who did not care about martial ethics and would not fire twice at close range with a double-barreled short-barrel gun. Keyes only pulled the trigger once, and amidst the explosion, a square piece of metal flew to the side of the undead monster that had just been created. Bang! Kacha! Clang! The sound of gunfire, the sound of the skeletal monster's body being blown apart, and the sound of it plowing the ground of the cavern after it was sent flying by a bullet that was about the same caliber as a cannonball due to the principle of conservation of momentum. As the smoke dispersed, at the end of the long gully lay the remains of a skeletal monster that had fallen on its back. Even if it was an undead creature that was pieced together from several kinds of remains, its current appearance was probably more in line with the meaning of remains compared to before. On its body, be it the beehive-like goblin bugbears and drow skeletons that covered its chest from its left shoulder down, or the huge minotaur skeleton on its right shoulder blade, everything had been reduced to dust. The green dots of light hovered above the wreckage, like fireflies hovering around it. In the center of its chest was a metal cube that was fading from its red-hot color due to the drop in temperature. And because of the fading color, the metal cube revealed its original shape of a music box. Vroom, vroom, vroom. 3 consecutive sounds, like the prelude to an engine's roar, rang out. The music box began to play a very infectious melody. The music echoed in the cavern. Hearing the familiar music, Keyes could not help but tiptoe to the rhythm. Chapter 10:31. Powerful Golem, are you mocking me? The music lingered in the air for a long time. The spirit of the soul-binding pagoda, who had been hiding since yesterday, finally chose to show itself. Before its body was revealed, it used magic to express its dissatisfaction to Keyes. That was why the cave was filled with such a question. Accompanied by the rustling sound of falling bricks, a lynx-like creature with fur similar to an orange cat and 8 short, thick, muscular claws on its abdomen broke a passage in the wall on one side of the golden house and walked out slowly. It's hard to imagine that the gold-swallowing beast is an expert at digging holes. Looking at the gold-swallowing beast named Cha-Cha, Keyes' golem avatar nodded. With the help of the special perspective of the quantum observer, he was now certain that the spirit of the soul-binding pagoda had taken over the body of the gold-swallowing beast. Life always has to find a way out for itself. Hearing Keyes' comment, the gold-swallowing beast replied with a double meaning. Although its throat and tongue could not speak human language due to the limitations of its biological structure, it still used magic to vibrate the air to simulate sound and tone. Indeed, affirming its reply, the essence golem's incarnation crouched down and tried its best to maintain the same height as it. Theoretically speaking, since you have been born and have the fait accompli of existing, you are indeed a special life form. Perhaps it was because it had taken over the body of the master cat, or because of its original personality. When it heard Keyes' acknowledgement of its existence, the spirit of the soul-binding pagoda remained indifferent. After it broke through the wall and walked back into the golden house, it had been lying on the ground, motionless. Fortunately, Keyes in his previous life had seen a lot of cats that pretended to be cold and aloof. The way to arouse their interest was actually very easy. They were just pretending to be cold and aloof. As long as you touched something that they cared about, it could be dried fish, it could be a cat toy, or it could even be a half-grown kitten that they gave birth to, these fellows who were originally cold and aloof would immediately throw a tantrum. As for what the spirit of the soul-binding pagoda cared about, Keyes naturally had his own speculations. He had long noticed that even though the gold-swallowing beast on the ground was acting as if it had seen through the mundane world, it was actually looking at the 2 items in the house of gold from the corner of its eyes. One of them was naturally Keyes' exquisite golem incarnation. There was no need to doubt this. The other thing that caught the gold-swallowing beast's attention was the perfect soul prism placed in the middle of the cave, which had become like a large piece of frosted glass. With your ability, you won't be able to fix that crystal. Fixing a crack on it will make you weak for a long time. Before he could finish, 2 bolts of lightning appeared out of nowhere and struck the head of the Essence Devil statue, which was as hard as a forge. Keyes didn't even bother to block them. He allowed the two lightning bolts to strike him. He only moved his left hand. The scaled-up whaler's muzzle was pointed downwards at a blob of air. No, it was not that there was nothing. After Keyes raised his gun and aimed, there was a slight disturbance in the light and shadow. The tower genie, who had possessed the gold-swallowing beast, revealed its hidden form. The tower genie that was lying on the ground was just a phantom. Its value lay in its ability to imitate the real tower genie. The tower genie still remembered the fate of the spliced bones. Even if its body was as strong as iron, it was still nervous when facing the whaler's gun. I advise you to take care of yourself. Keyes gave it a mild warning before he continued what he had just said. Actually, you're not that unique. Believe me, this is not sarcasm. In fact, a long time ago, a life form that was highly similar to you was born in the multiverse. Its name was Clinchinian, but people usually call it broken crystal. It is said that it is an ancient relic of chaos and evil. The dark divine artifact was a foot-long, four-sided crystal that stood upright like an icicle and constantly flashed with light. It was a wondrous object created by a group of 7 liches in a distant crystal wall system thousands of years ago. The creation process exhausted the lich's power. Clinchinian also stole the magical power that kept them immortal and used it as fuel for its own initial pulse of life. When they created Clinchinian, the liches even summoned a Baylor lord named Axel Few to assist them. However, that fellow threw the explosive power of Clinchinian back into the bottomless abyss. Axel Few thought that the broken crystal had been destroyed in the explosion, but hundreds of years later, he found traces of the broken crystal again. During that time, Clinchinian had already turned the owners of many worlds into tyrants and controlled many armies to carry out massacres to achieve its goal of destruction and self-destruction. Because he coveted the power of the divine artifact, Axel Few embarked on the path of searching for and controlling the broken crystal. His ending was quite a classic. The Baylor Lord was also controlled by the broken crystal, and like its previous owner, he too embarked on the path of self-destruction. However, after stirring up a few waves, the existence of Clinchinian was still discovered by the gods. According to legend, it was first found by the god of justice, Tyr. That great divine power used only one punch to completely shatter the broken crystal, which had already grown into the shape of a magic crystal tower. Then, 7 kind-hearted liches and a blazing Templar took over the follow-up work. This combination was the exact opposite of 7 liches and a Baylor lord, and what they did was the exact opposite of creating the broken crystal. They worked together to deprive the broken crystal of all its power. Clinchinian was eventually destroyed, but its characteristics were still recorded in some arcane texts. Looking at the gold-devouring beast that he was pointing at with the Wailing One, and seeing the confusion, surprise, and other complex emotions in its eyes, Keyes knew that his words were effective. He did not keep it in suspense, and directly told the rest of the story in one breath. Clinchinian's power is a mystery, at least to the people of that era. As a special life form, it also has its own division into factions. Unsurprisingly, it belongs to the chaotic evil faction, and the power it absorbed before it committed evil was something that many kind-hearted people treasured, the light of the eternal blaze. According to arcane texts, every hour the broken crystal is exposed to the sun, it can absorb 12 energy levels, just like a warlock accumulating spell-casting energy. It can only store 144 energy levels at a time, and any more exposure will be useless. Every 2 hours, even if Clinchinian didn't use any spells, it would slowly dissipate 2 levels of energy, dissipating in the form of ordinary heat radiation. According to the will of the holder, Clinchinian can use the stored energy to create many magical effects. Although the magical effects can be retained at night, it can no longer create new magical effects after the sun sets below the horizon, and the energy it retains is gradually fading. Therefore, the best time to defeat Clinchinian is late at night, before dawn, when the light of the eternal blaze is about to shine on the earth. Clinchinian is actually at its weakest. Keys raised the muzzle and stared at the tower genie that had possessed the gold-devouring beast with his flaming eyes. Just like you last night, the darker the night, the less you have the ability to resist fate. On the other hand, after dawn, the result is exactly the opposite. Chapter 10:32. Thy power is rising, Quest said in a tempting tone. However, he was telling the truth. From last night to this morning, after a night of fighting and being hit by the messenger of peace of the scale of perpetual order, the insect lord had lost at least 1/3 of its power. Therefore, the suppression he had on the soul, binding pagoda spirit in his body, was much weaker than when he first arrived. Not only that, but just as Quest had said, the tower genie also sensed that its mana, which had been slowly fading after nightfall, had gathered once more with the rise of the eternal blaze. In fact, it had even increased a little. At this moment, even the soul binding pagoda spirit who was born with a mechanized mind couldn't help but feel excited. Maybe, however, you don't have much time left. Just in time, Keys poured a bucket of cold water on it. However, his purpose wasn't to attack the pagoda spirit, but to arouse its sense of danger. Barzab is not an idiot who doesn't have any senses. In fact, with my arrival, the insect lord must have begun to face the many blind spots in its body. In other words, it has already discovered you. If I leave now, nothing needed to be said. Keys didn't say any more threats. With the pagoda spirit's intelligence, it knew everything it needed to know. In that case, the pagoda spirit, whose head was pointed at by Keys with a wailing, moved its 8 strong, thick legs and arched its back like a real cat. I have no choice but to cooperate with you now. It was still using spells to control the vibration of the air. However, when it cast the spell this time, the soul-binding pagoda spirit who had taken over the body of the gold-swallowing beast did something else. The muscles on the gold-swallowing beast were like tightly wound clockwork. When it loosened its muscles, it released a powerful kinetic energy. It shot out like a sharp arrow and waved its sharp claws. In an instant, a hole the size of an adult's palm was dug out on the wall of the cave. A creature with 2 claws and a body like a snake was hiding inside. Lindiria. Last night, Barzab had created tens of thousands of these creatures and relied on them to defeat more than half of the legion of the devil's biological weapons. Although most of the biological weapons of Lindiria and the legion of the devil had been destroyed by the messenger of peace, there were still a few Lindiria who survived. However, most of them had just been born not long ago and had not undergone rapid evolution. Therefore, Barzab had no use for this creature in the upcoming battle. Of course, they still had their uses. After Keys' essence golem avatar crashed into the spirit-binding tower, the winged insect overlord immediately ordered some Lindiria to follow. Even though these Lindiria would not be able to fight the golem of mystery head-on, their small size made them less conspicuous. Therefore, they were very qualified to act as spies. The conversation between Keys and the spirit of the pagoda was clearly transmitted to the ears of these Lindiria. At the same time, these guys also passed the message to their creator. Controlling the body of the gold-swallowing beast, the spirit of the pagoda killed the Lindiria spy who was eavesdropping on the conversation. Then, it looked at Keys with its emerald-like eyes. "You're plotting against me?" In an instant, it understood the key point. It had just discovered the traces of Lindiria because of Keys' reminder. The latter obviously already knew that there was an eavesdropper in the cave. The essence golem neither denied nor admitted. It only said as if it was stating a fact. What does that have to do with anything? Do you still naively think that you can resolve the conflict with that person? What Keys said was still the truth. He had been an honest megalosaurus since he was young. He had always disdained to lie to others. To this, the spirit of the pagoda could not refute. However, it immediately thought of another problem. After saying so much to me, you just want me to stand on your side and create trouble for Barzab. I can agree to cooperate with you. However, you should also know that the best way for me to attack the flying insect lord is to re-enter the perfect soul prism and transform into the magical crystal life similar to Clinzinabin that you just mentioned. That way, I can restore part of the control authority of the pagoda and compete with Barzab, who has merged with the pagoda for a part of the control of the body. However, you just said that it is impossible for me to repair the damaged perfect soul prism. So, that's right. Keys interrupted its narration. Although the spirit of the pagoda spoke very quickly by using the vibrating noise in the air, it still retained its habit of applying logic to its words instead of using rhetoric. This made Keys feel that it was a waste of time. He had already figured out the logic, otherwise he would not have come here to meet with it. Like flowing water, the enlarged wailing beast in the left hand of the essence golem dissolved into his body. Then a hole appeared in his left hand, revealing the sincere gift that Keys had prepared for this meeting. It was a hexahedral crystal. Although there was only the fluorescent green soul light of the undead in the cave and the red fire leaking from the furnace above the essence golem's head, the crystal still revealed a gorgeous color. Red, orange, yellow, green, blue, purple. These were the colors of a spectrum, and also the secret colors hidden in the light of the eternal blaze. Another perfect soul prism. The spirit of the pagoda vibrated the air and spoke. It had tried its best not to show its emotions, but the short burst of air still exposed its current mood. I may be able to enter it, but what's the use of that? And it's much smaller than the one that Barzab prepared. The space for me to perform is... This is the blazing sun crystal. Keys once again interrupted the spirit of the pagoda's logical analysis. The perfect soul prism is just the raw material to make it. Don't tell me that you don't feel the difference between it and the perfect soul prism. After that, Keys did not say anything else. He stood up straight, and the right hand of the essence golem punched forward. The arm made of adamantine and mithril punched the air with a bang. At the same time, following his action, the perfect soul prism at the center of the cave that had been modeled and damaged completely shattered, falling into pieces all over the ground. If the old doesn't go, the new won't come. Keys looked down at the spirit of the pagoda, who was a little confused by his sudden action, and then threw the blazing sun crystal in his left hand to the original position of the perfect soul prism. The golden threads that were connected to the original perfect soul prism seemed to have found their backbone, again as they whooshed over and reconnected to the blazing sun crystal that Keys had thrown over. At the same time, the blazing sun crystal immediately emitted a dazzling light, as if there was a small sun in the cave. Chapter 10:33. Bathing in the sun's rays, the gold-eater beast, which was possessed by the spirit of the soul-binding pagoda, closed its eyes in comfort. It could feel that the blazing crystal was compatible with itself. It's a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Keys lowered his head and looked at the gold-eater beast, once again tempting it with the obvious facts. The spirit of the soul-binding pagoda could not let go of this opportunity. Just as it already knew, Barzab already knew of its existence through the spies of Lindiria. When everything was settled, and the insect lord was still alive, he would definitely not let go of the spirit of the soul-binding pagoda, which had once deceived death. I'm willing to try once, but what should I do? For the first time, the spirit of the soul-binding pagoda used simple words to ask Keys. It's very simple. A crack appeared on the face of Keys's enigmatic golem, which looked like smiling lips. Previously, you helped a drow mage create a prism warrior, and just now, you killed a young Lindiria with your own hands. I'm sure you can see the shadow of the prism warrior in those little insects. Their birth was also due to Barzab's theft of your research results. Now, you might as well be bolder. I've already prepared a crystal to store the core for you. With it, you can cast spells as easily as before. I suggest that you try to create a new body for yourself after occupying the blazing crystal. Keys's meaning was very direct. He hoped that the spirit of the soul-binding pagoda would directly refine him into a prism warrior after he regained his strength. That's impossible. The spirit of the soul-binding pagoda flatly refused at first, then began to state its reason. Powerful golem, I don't know how you know that I've created a prism warrior, but I'm sure you don't know that to create such a warrior, I don't just need magic energy. To put more simply, even if I recover all my spellcasting abilities, it's extremely difficult to create flesh and blood out of thin air, and it'll take twice the effort for half the result. Moreover, even if I were to disregard everything and refine a Prism Warrior in the end, so what? Do you think that with a Prism Warrior as an assistant, you can defeat the powerful Barzab? Unless, this time, Keys did not interrupt it. Instead, it stopped talking, because the spirit of the soul, binding Pagoda, suddenly had an epiphany and figured out the key to the information revealed by the mystery golem. It seemed that they did not lack high-quality flesh. What do you mean? The spirit of the soul, binding Pagoda, hesitated. That's right. The essence golem nodded. After fusing with the spirit binding tower, everything here has been soaked in the flesh and blood of the winged insect overlord. What I want you to do is to try your best to create a Prism Warrior based on the spirit binding tower. In other words, I hope that you can become a malignant tumor on the overlord of flying insect's body and become an equal to it. The spirit of the soul, binding Pagoda, imagined that there would suddenly be a gigantic Prism Warrior in Barzab's body, and it would continuously attack its original host cruelly and mercilessly. This was not only a real blow to the Lord of Hell, but also a slap to the face of the Lord of Hell. However, if the spirit of the soul, binding Pagoda, really killed Barzab, then the Lord of Hell's face would not be so important. The essence golem made a pleased gesture. The spirit of the soul, binding Pagoda, controlled the body of the metal-swallowing beast and slowly walked towards the place where the light of the blazing crystal shone. As it got closer to the sparkling crystal, the spirit of the soul, binding Pagoda, felt warmer and warmer. It was excited by the vast power it felt. Of course, in addition to being excited, it also felt a little hesitant. However, the spirit of the soul, binding Pagoda, soon forgot about this feeling. Just as Keys said, it's a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. If the spirit of the soul, binding Pagoda, gave up on this opportunity, then it would have to face the terrifying Barzab alone in the future. What was worse was that he might have to face Kith, who was even more terrifying than the winged insect overlord. The spirit of the soul, binding Pagoda, did not need any guidance. After deciding to take a gamble, it immediately knew what to do. It opened its mind and felt the light of the eternal blaze. When the spirit of the soul, binding Pagoda, was about a dozen yards away from the blazing crystal, the body of the metal-swallowing beast began to change. This lynx-like creature with 8 stubby legs began to tremble uncontrollably. As it trembled, its orange fur and the bright red flesh underneath started to fade away layer by layer. It was as if it was being tortured. However, the spirit of the soul, binding Pagoda, did not make a sound. It was unknown whether the spirit of the soul, binding Pagoda, was using its powerful willpower to endure the pain, or whether it had sealed off its senses, or whether it was not painful at all. When the spirit of the soul, binding Pagoda, finally reached the vicinity of the blazing crystal, its appearance as a metal-swallowing beast had completely faded away. However, the fur and flesh that had fallen off did not leave any stains. As they fell off, they turned into specks of light and floated back to the spirit of the soul, binding Pagoda. Thus, the spirit of the soul, binding Pagoda, had become a virtual creature made up of billions of specks of light. The specks of light continued to shine like billions of miniature stars, forming a hazy nebula that looked like a metal-swallowing beast. Like a cat that was chasing after a butterfly, the spirit of the soul, binding Pagoda, leaped up from below the blazing crystal and touched the crystal that was being pulled by thousands of golden threads. Like fireworks that had been scattered, the specks of light suddenly broke into a cloud of smoke. Perhaps the light around the blazing crystal was too bright, but the cloud of smoke could still be seen at first, but it gradually melted into the light. It was as if it had proved a famous idiom, dust and light. Seeing this, Keys's essence golem avatar did not stay any longer and strode out of the cave. Everything that needed to be set up had been set up. Although there were no restrictions in the blazing crystal that he gave to the spirit of the soul, binding Pagoda, to gain its trust, Keys believed that as long as the spirit of the soul binding pagoda still had its intelligence, it would be able to assess that cooperation was the best choice. Thus, Keys did not hesitate and did not wait here for it to transform into a gigantic prism warrior. Instead, he prepared to walk out of the soul binding pagoda and begin the finishing work of this battle. In the entire cave, there was only a bright and dazzling blazing crystal and a music box embedded in a broken skeleton that was playing impassioned music on its own, as if to celebrate the birth of a powerful life form. Chapter 1034. In the Realm of Equality. Fists as large as Urban's cannons flew up and down. The two goblin gods, Hrughek and Kugobiag, had been hammered by the iron fists of equality until they wanted to cry, but had no tears. No one used divine spells. No one used spells. No one used psychic powers. And no one could summon helpers. It was simple and unadorned, without any fancy tricks. It was purely a competition of fists. The brawny ogre Neru, who had just been promoted to a demigod and could be said to be a rising star among the gods, let the two goblin gods, who were much older than him, experience the feeling of being beaten again. The only thing that comforted the two gods was that this realm of equality had a time limit. Because Neru's status was much lower than the two of them, the time it lasted was really not long. It was only half an hourglass. During this period of time, except for standing still and being beaten because they did not react in time at first, the two gods had taken emergency measures such as wandering, flying kites, and sacrificing their fellow Taoist, but not me. They had survived the long half an hourglass. Although each of them had serious injuries, when they left the realm of equality and could use divine power to heal their bodies, they were all so excited that their eyes were brimming with tears. It's not easy. Neru, like them, walked out of the realm of equality almost at the same time. As soon as he returned to the real world, this tall and brawny ogre fell into the sea with a bang. The splash of water caused a tsunami in the local area. Neru did not use divine power to levitate himself in the air. He just fell into the sea and let the sea water go over his head. The battle that belonged to him was over. Even though the brawny ogre loved blood-boiling battles, he was not brainless. Now that both sides could use the power of divine spells, he was no longer a match for the two goblin deities. Now, what he needed to do was to escape. The reason why he chose to swim under the surface of the sea instead of flying in the air was that he wanted to make space for others to fight. Just as the two gods were using divine spells to repair their avatars' broken bones and bleeding, a powerful being who had remained invisible since the arrival of Keys, Mithril Golem, also revealed his ferocity. The great calamity and disaster both moved. This powerful abomination of fire, Phaeton, who had been attached to the body of the old ghost goddess Kajiluna, immediately burst out with light blue flames and pounced on the two goblin avatars, enveloping them. The blazing flames contained blasphemous divinity and divine power. Phaeton's roasting caused large and small blisters to appear on Hrughek and Kugobia's skin. Their mouths, ears, eyes, nostrils, eye sockets. The flames slowly flowed and squeezed into their bodies from every orifice that could be found on their bodies. The god of the bugbear goblin, Hrughek's situation was slightly better. He could at least take out a magic artifact made of an unknown creature's skull and buckle it on his head to resist the erosion of the flames. However, the god of goblin slavery was not so lucky. Being oppressed by the legion of the devil for an entire night, being baptized by the messenger of peace, and being beaten up for half an hourglass in the realm of equality all consumed part of Kugobia's power. Therefore, when he was attacked by the abomination of fire, his avatar was actually extremely weak. Soon, with an unknown insult, the precious avatar of the god of goblin slavery, for a weak divine power, every avatar was an important treasure, was completely turned into a burning torch with a bang. As the flames continued to burn, the divine spark that he had injected into this avatar could not withstand and was forcibly annihilated. Killing a god's avatar was definitely something worth celebrating for the abomination of fire. Although it was not an easy victory, Phaeton's morale was high. He continued to incite the flames to burn Hrughek. "Save me!" the god of the bugbear goblin roared. It was a pity that Mephisto and Disbat, who were supposed to be on the same side as him, were unable to free themselves. The former was being ganged up on by a group of Seraphim Templar Jansen and a group of Seraphim Templar for sneaking an attack on Quest, while the latter was being stabbed in the back by the scales of the Eternal Order Chamber of Commerce. He was carelessly placed in a pot with added ingredients and kept boiling because of that. At the scene, other than Barzab, who was too busy looking after himself, there was only Keys, who had just walked out of the spirit binding tower. The young blue dragon's goblin incarnation twisted its neck vividly and glanced at the god of Earth Spirit Bear, who was frantically crying for help. Then, a crack appeared on its head that had several furnaces on it, as if it was smiling. I've heard that material planes nourished by the ashes of a god's avatar will become very fertile. Good things come in pairs. Since Kagobia Pavilion has already done so, you can accompany him with peace of mind. After saying that, cracks that resembled shark gills appeared on the surface of the goblin incarnation's body in many places. The liquid mithril in its body had completed its self-molding and turned into a high-power propulsion engine that could eject gas. With the treasure that he had once obtained, Keys could extract large amounts of gas and fuel from the elemental plane of Earth by sacrificing gems. With this set of additional power assistance system, under the effect of levitation magic, the goblin incarnation, which was already extremely light, instantly became more agile than a goshawk and more swift than a falcon. Quest immediately leapt into the air, his finger parallel to Barzab's face, grabbing the dragon-headed warhammer hammer that he had left outside the soul-binding tower to perform circumcisions on the winged insect liege's true body as if it was continuously applying the hoop curse. "Long time no see. I think you also missed that old friend of yours." As he spoke, Keys exerted force on the dragon-head warhammer that was about to bind Barzab into a Michelin model. A large part of Barzab's skin was cut open by the sawtooth on the handle of the hammer. After being ganged up on by several parties, Barzab's current state of mind was not very clear due to the effects of some follow-up magic. Furthermore, his mouth was also stuck by the sawtooth handle of the dragon-head warhammer, so he could not say anything even if he wanted to. However, the gaze that he looked at Keys was not fake. It was a kind of coldness with a strong sense of sarcasm. Previously, he had been attacked by 2 lords of hell, 2 avatars of gods, and Keys, a powerful goblin incarnation whose strength could not be seen clearly, but he had still managed to survive. Now, the parties that had the momentum to form an alliance had already broken up, and only Keys was still hanging around in front of him. So what if I have a sharp blade on me? Once I recover, I'll deal with a goblin like you, isn't that? However, at this moment, something strange happened. Chapter 1035. What a strange sight it was. At this moment, even evil demons who were used to seeing all sorts of restricted scenes in places like the 9 hells of Bartholomew, the scorching inferno, and the bottomless abyss were surprised by what was happening to Bartholomew. Keys had just cut a new wound on the Lord of Hell's waist with his dragon-head warhammer. Normally, with such a wound, Barzab would be able to heal it in a few breaths, even if he was tired. However, just as the granules on the edge of the wound were clinging and entangling with each other, an extremely strange head suddenly rushed out of the wound in a frenzy without caring about anything else. It looked like an alien that had broken out of the body, but it also looked like a descendant that had been cut open from the belly button of the insect lord. However, from the strangeness of its appearance, it looked like an evil creature that would devour the body. There is no doubt that this evil creature was the spirit of the soul-binding pagoda that Keys had personally instigated. With the help of the blazing sun crystal, its spellcasting ability had been restored. In the end, it had even created this strange prismatic creature. I thought you would create a prismatic warrior, but you ended up with something like this. Keys shook his head. No matter what, the spirit of the soul-binding pagoda had fulfilled its promise. Forget it. I'll just treat it as a surprise for Barzab. Keys continued to tighten his grip on the dragon-head warhammer. He could already feel the insect lord struggling. It was obvious that even a powerful lord of hell would not be able to remain calm when such a strange creature suddenly appeared in its body. He was frightened by this scene. What was worse was that the creature with the head of a lynx for pairs of claws and a tail that was connected to a certain part of its body like a lindo worm kept struggling to crawl out. Barzab could feel his body rapidly weakening. This prismatic creature created by the spirit of the soul, binding pagoda, shook its huge body and shook off some of the flesh and blood attached to its body, all of which were the insect lord's flesh and blood, revealing a body of pitch-black scales. Bathed in the light of eternal blaze, the soul-binding tower's spiritual power was rising rapidly as if it had inexhaustible strength. Barzab, its body continued to wriggle upward, and its head turned more than 90 degrees. It glared at the lord of the flying insects. I think that today is the best day to commemorate your death. Roar. After saying those provocative words, the binding spirit pagoda spirit suddenly raised its head and let out a roar similar to a dragon's roar. Several bolts of lightning, as thick as carriage wheels, suddenly shot out from its mouth. Peepa, 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 all of the lightning struck Barzab, the deep purple electric snakes slithering around his body. Large patches of charred flesh appeared on his body after fusing with the soul-shackling tower. Even though he didn't cry out in pain, judging from the severity of his injuries, it wasn't easy for him to survive the lightning strikes. After all the defensive spells on Barzab's body had been erased, and he could only rely on his body to resist the lightning bolts. Not only that, the soul-binding pagoda spirit still didn't give up on attacking Barzab after its successful attack. Of course, it didn't want to miss this opportunity, but more importantly, it was because of its hatred for the insect lord. Previously, Barzab had tricked it when the insect lord was just born. It used all kinds of spells to bombard Barzab, and at the same time, used its extremely flexible body to quietly restrain half of the insect lord's body from bottom to top. Barzab's body had been bound by two types of bindings, including the sawtooth handle of the dragon warhammerer and the long worm-like prism creature. If someone who didn't know the situation was present, they would think that this guy was into some kind of unhealthy game. Of course not. Barzab's miserable state could no longer be described with conventional words. This was beyond the definition of game. It was as if he was suffering from 2 layers of dismemberment. That's right, 2 layers. The dragon head warhammer's sawtooth handle reigned in his body, tearing apart his tendons and muscles. The red rays that shot out from the prismatic creature's eyes turned into all kinds of evocation spells. This was a bit similar to Clinton's Xenobon, except for some enchantment spells. When the magic crystals were cast, they would shoot out red rays and constantly ravage the wounds on his body. When the wounds opened up, the prismatic creature that the soul-binding pagoda spirit had transformed into would accurately bite the wounds and swallow a large piece of the Lord of Hell's flesh. In a very short time, the insect lord's body was ravaged and became much thinner. It was not only because of the 2 layers of restraints, but also because of the bombardment of spells and the prismatic creature's devouring of flesh and blood. Blood flowed and dripped from various parts of Barzab's body. The crimson blood would turn into evil-looking diamonds when it fell into the sea. If an ordinary creature came into contact with them, it would not take long for them to fall and transform into the Batsa devil. However, because of the all-night battle, there were no ordinary creatures in the sea. Moreover, if these blood diamonds were properly collected and transported to the Sigil City to be sold, they would probably fetch a sky-high price. In theory, the more Barzab bled, the more blood that the scale of perpetual order could recover after a period of time. Enough. In the end, Barzab's fear of death still triumphed over his morbid pride after suffering from 1,000 cuts. He returned to his original appearance and no longer wasted his magic power to cover up the curse that the Lord of 9 Hells Astamors had cast on him. This Lord of Hell turned into the slug that made him famous. Bloated layers of fat began to appear out of thin air on his body, piling up and filling up the numerous wounds that were torn and bitten. 2 soft, snail-like antennae drilled out of the top of his head and drooped down. His skin began to secrete a highly toxic and corrosive mucus. Even the dragon head warhammer, with a sharp sawtooth handle, began to slip. "Come out," Barzab roared. At this time, his face no longer had the handsome appearance of a fallen angel. There were too many wrinkles on his face. Instead, it looked like the head of a Neapolitan dog covered in a large amount of pustules and mucus. Barzab's appearance was extremely ferocious. When he roared, a forked tongue with spikes protruded from the gaps between his serrated teeth. He exerted force and temporarily expanded the two chains that bound him. Then, he freed his two arms and was able to grasp the body of the prismatic creature that the spirit of the soul-binding pagoda had transformed into. His claws pierced deeply into the scales of the prismatic creature, but he did not tear it apart. Instead, he wrapped it around his wrist twice and then tried to pull it out of his body. However, how could Keys let him have his way? Before preparing for the final battle with Barzab, when he instigated the spirit of the soul-binding pagoda to rebel, he also buried another secret weapon. Chapter 1036. He used his sharp fangs to devour the enemy from the inside. He used his venom to corrode the enemy's heart, liver, spleen, and stomach. He used vicious spells to destroy the enemy's energy core. He rose from the spirit-binding tower and ran all the way to Barzab's chest, riding on the face of the Lord of Hell. The tactics named Nihult will forever be recorded in the War Manual of the Scale of Perpetual Order. The War Manual of the Scale of Perpetual Order, Nihult Chapter. Allowing Barzab to break free from the chains of the dragon head warhammer, Keys stretched out his hand and took back the terrible weapon. The insect lord was in so much pain that he almost went crazy. The pain caused by the prism creature created by the spirit of the spirit-binding tower had not disappeared, and a new pain was arranged without stopping. Moreover, the pain this time was far more painful than the previous one. It was really like alien breaking out of the body. The hand that Keys placed in the insect's body tore his chest, crushed his sternum, and broke out of the cocoon. The giant rust-colored steel mouth tore open Barzab's chest, and a beating heart was in its mouth. The rusty color was dyed by the blood and flesh of the Lord of Hell. As the big head shook twice, the clockwork Megalosaurus finally showed some of its original color. You will burn in the fury of the Megalosaurus. You will drown in the burning acid. You will beg for a quick death in the putrid swamp. You will fall apart in the merciless thunder prison. You will definitely perish in the cold wind. The familiar battle cry resounded in every corner of the world. During Keys's second expedition to the front line of the bloody war, the clockwork Megalosaurus that he won from the god of virtual games, Stim, appeared in the battlefield of the Ash World. With Keys's expeditions over the years, although the energy core that powered the clockwork Megalosaurus was still the phantom dragons, their number had reached an astonishing number. Among them, there were nearly 10 phantom dragons that had reached the legendary level or were close to the age of the ancient dragons. They spared no effort to instill soul power, and the body of the clockwork Megalosaurus suddenly became noisy. A layer of cold frost began to appear on the armor plate made by Bartholomew, tightly sealing the violent energy in the body. The iconic clockwork on its back had also changed from 1 to 3. When the clockwork Megalosaurus broke out of Barzab's body, they began to quickly twist and wind. The multi-stroke engine at its core, named after Moradin, the Lord of the Dwarves, also began to burn the refined black oil collected from all over the Ash World. With the help of the spring taken from the mechanical realm legend Duayuan Demon Grave, the surging heat energy was converted into potential energy, waiting for a certain moment to erupt. Amidst the screeching of gears, the scales of the clockwork Megalosaurus assembled and combined, turning into countless chainsaws that were constantly spinning at high speed. When it crawled out, it did not need to do anything else, and just relied on these chainsaws to directly tear a large amount of the flying insect overlord's flesh and blood. With a loud pop and a large amount of the demon overlord's tainted blood splashing everywhere, this terrifying legendary constructed monster finally ejected out of Barzab's chest. The armor plates on its two ribs suddenly opened, and hot steam gushed out, making a sound similar to a steam whistle. Walala, the clockwork megalosaurus shook and even spread out the folded alloy wings on its back. When the light of the eternal blaze at the top of the sky shone on it, it would emit a fluorescent brilliance. In a sense, the clockwork megalosaurus, after several upgrades and modifications, could now be regarded as a prism megalosaurus construct. The eternal blaze could replenish its energy. Under the combined effect of magic and technology, although there were many energy supply systems in its body, the construct did not appear to be bloated in any way. Its slender neck, sharp and powerful claws, and the mechanical armor plates all over its body made it more in line with the aesthetics of the megalosaurus. At the same time, its physical strength was even more shocking. Activate the assault mode. When the clockwork megalosaurus crawled out of Barzub's body, the three springs on its back were all wound up. As the mechanical voice device implanted in its body broadcasted a message, the colossal automaton also revealed its terrifying side. This was also its ultimate move. Like climbing on a wall, the clockwork megalosaurus tapped lightly on the true body of the insect lord and the prism creature that was desperately trying to bind it. Then, it wriggled its way to Barzub's head. Compared to the true body of the Lord of Hell, or the prism creature that the spirit of the soul-binding tower had transformed into, the clockwork megalosaurus was perhaps smaller in size, but its movements were more agile. It stretched out its pair of powerful front claws and grabbed the insect lord's head. Then, it showed a human-like malicious smile. "I'm sorry." The clockwork megalosaurus roared in the language of megalosaurus. Then it straightened its neck. Steel drill spit. It opened its mouth wide, and a tongue that looked like Xenomorph's internest tooth shot out of its throat. This tongue was completely molded and pieced together by a very strong alloy. As the clockwork megalosaurus spit, it smashed the insect lord's closed teeth and shot its tongue into Barzub's throat. This was connected to the tongue. In addition to cutting and piercing, each segment of the tongue had its own function. It could either release lightning, spit acid, shoot blazing flames, or simply have other megalosaurus spitting ability. The clockwork megalosaurus steel drill spit was not only equivalent to giving Barzub a gastroscopy, but it also used the dragon's breath to destroy Barzub's body, which was already riddled with holes. Riding on the insect lord's face, the clockwork megalosaurus gave it a very deep and terrifying kiss. Even though Barzub had lived for more than hundreds of thousands of years, from the scorching Templar to the fallen angel to the Lord of Hell, he had never enjoyed such a treatment. This kiss almost took away half of the Lord of Hell's life. At this moment, his huge, slug-like body was emitting grayish-black smoke from every pore. Most of his organs were dehydrated, oxidized, and even burned to ashes. Naturally, his body could no longer secrete even a little bit of mucus. He had become numb and scabby and was no longer as round as before. Chapter 1037. Through the combination of Eagle Eye and Magic Mirror, the Nefermindis was hovering in the skies of the Ashen World. Apart from the Paladin Jensen, who was leading his team to fight another Archdevil incarnation, the rest of the higher-ups of the scale of Perpetual Order were watching the live broadcast intently. "It's done." When they saw the flying insect Archdevil being crushed by Dragon Ride, the Ogre Gourmet Blue, the general manager of the logistics department of the scale of Perpetual Order, immediately let out an excited cry. His shout also ignited the emotions of everyone present. After all, the success of the Megalosaurus surprise attack had practically sealed the victory of the battle. The Megalosaurus was made of steel, clockwork, gears, and a series of mechanical structures. It was like an octopus clinging onto Barzub's face, as if it had turned into a pile driver. Its steel drill spit pierced into the flying insect Overlord's face again and again. Soon, the Overlord's face and brain were mixed together. Even if it was a powerful Archdevil, such an attack would definitely be considered a heavy blow. Although it wouldn't die immediately, it would take a long time for it to recover. Moreover, How could Keys give it the chance to recover? In fact, after the Megalosaurus had completed the Nihult tactic and successfully used Dragon Ride, the Golem had also joined in the attack. Supreme Magic Limit, Thieving Magic, Supreme Magic Duplication, Spell Expansion. With the help of the complete Mice energy core within the Golem, Keys directly used two relatively unorthodox legendary spells. They complemented each other, and as soon as the casting ended, Keys cast multiple thieving magic in an instant. A secret box popped out from the Golem's shoulder, revealing blank secret scrolls hidden within. These scrolls were tanned with multiple layers of pit fiend skin, mixed with mithril threads to increase the efficiency of mana flow. There were no dazzling light effects. When Quest's magic theft took effect, a blob of black ink appeared on each scroll out of thin air. It dripped onto the secret scrolls, and magically, it automatically rendered magic circles. No, it should be said that the effect of these legendary spells was to strip the spell of the highest level from the target's body. Because Keys had used spell expansion on thieving magic, the effect was to strip away some of the defensive spells that Barzub had prepared in order from high to low level. Perfect Resurrection, Owos Broken Phylactery, Great Cloning, Super Magic Explosion, Planar Collapse, Barzub's Ascension. All in all, there were powerful spells such as Life-Saving, Counterattack, Seed Explosion, and so on. They were all stolen from the Insect Lord by thieving magic in the form of secret scrolls and stored in another way. Quest was familiar with most of these spells, but there was a small portion that he had never heard of. It was very likely that Balzeb had invented them himself to be used at certain times as a trump card. I knew it would be like this. Keys was not at all surprised that the Insect Lord still had so many secrets on him, even after suffering such a terrible blow. In fact, if he had not already calculated this in his heart, he would not have used such an extremely rare legendary spell, like Thieving Magic, at the beginning. Moreover, if it were a spellcaster who did not have a Mice energy core, even if they had thought of this, they would not be able to squander their power extravagantly like Kith. They would not be able to create more than a dozen thieving magic in one breath to madly steal. In fact, the word plunder might be more appropriate, and when the spell's effect was over, they would add another one. When Barzub was bombarded by Megalosaurus steel drill breath because there was no way to heal his cracked brain, Keys had been repeatedly using thieving magic and spell expansion. It was not until this legendary spell began to strip away some spells within the Ninth Circle that Keys stopped squandering the energy of the Mythic core. At this time, due to the large-scale use of energy, part of the energy released from the body of the exquisite golem had begun to make the adamantine on the surface of the golem slightly red. The air of his incarnation had been heated to a certain extent and had produced a red shift. After stealing a large number of Barzub's trump cards, Keys had more than 100 secret scrolls floating around him. He waved his hand and gathered all these scrolls together, then stuffed them back into the secret box in his body, properly storing them away. In the future, whether it was to be sold in Sigil City or kept for research on the scale of Perpetual Order, these secret scrolls would be an immeasurable amount of wealth. However, now was not the time to think about these problems. He still had to concentrate on managing this Barzub's funeral. With a soft click, the switch of the secret box closed, and all the scrolls inside were sent into the depths of the exquisite golem's body. Immediately after, Keys took the Dragonhead Warhammer and knocked 3 times on the chest of his golem incarnation. Supreme Magic Limit, Gigantification. In the blink of an eye, the exquisite golem was like a flesh and blood creature blessed by the gigantification spell, and its body rapidly increased in proportion. Logically speaking, the gigantification spell was very difficult to have an effect on a construct like a golem. This was because the essence of this spell was actually to turn the magic energy into matter and fill the body of the creature, and then achieve the effect of increasing the size of the body. On the other hand, if the construct was affected by the giant enlargement spell, it meant that the spell's energy wasn't enough to create enough mechanical matter out of thin air. Secondly, if the proportion of the mechanical structure in the construct was increased, some parameters, such as their work efficiency, would change, and the entire construct might not be able to function normally. However, these problems were not a problem for the exquisite golem. Because it had a mice energy core as its energy core, Keys's golem incarnation had an abundant amount of energy. If the magic energy contained in the gigantification spell was not enough to support the increase in size, then he could use his own energy to supplement it. And because the exquisite golem's body was almost solid, and its interior was filled with a mixture of liquid adamantine and mithril, they could transform into any kind of mechanical structure at any time. And as the golem's body increased, these mechanical structures could also be adjusted accordingly. So even after being affected by the gigantification spell, the exquisite golem could still operate normally. In the end, when the exquisite golem's body stopped growing, its originally over 20 feet tall body had become a towering giant, standing in front of the true body of the insect, Lord Barzub. It could also look at him as an equal. In order to adapt to this change, the dragon head warhammer hammer also became bigger and was held in Keys's hand like a small mountain. "Please allow me." Keys raised the warhammer above his head with both hands, and a crack appeared on the liquid metal surface of the exquisite golem's face, as if it was grinning. "Let me give you the strongest sound of the funeral overture." As he spoke, Keys swung the warhammer at the insect lord's sluggish body. He dodged the megalosaurus that was lying on Barzub's face, but he did not care about the prism monster that was tightly wrapped around Barzub's body, created by the soul-binding pagoda spirit. It looked like a cross between Lindiria and the Metal Eater. Of course, the latter did not really care, and the soul-binding pagoda spirit was very open-minded about this. Therefore, when Keys's dragon head warhammer smashed Barzub's body into an L shape, and even the prism monster that was wrapped around him was directly smashed into two, the soul-binding pagoda spirit was still extremely excited, as if it was not its body that was injured. "Smash that guy into a pulp? Quick! 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 Ha ha! The fall of the Lord of Hell is today." Chapter 1038. Asterisk smack, smack, smack. Asterisk the hammer was like a meteor, the sound reverberating in the air. It was not easy for Keys to find an opportunity to beat up a drowning dog, so he went all out and did not show any mercy. Even though the flying insect lord was in the form of a slug, and normal blunt force damage could not harm its true body, how could the damage caused by Keys's dragon head hammer be ordinary? The force of each blow was so great that it could even destroy a large piece of Barzub's flesh on a molecular level. In the eyes of others, the head of the dragon head hammer seemed to have a miniature black hole, and every time it smashed, it would viciously bite and devour a part of the Lord of Hell's body. However, Keys was unable to accurately control the position of each blow. The prismatic monster created by the spirit of the soul-binding pagoda to bind this giant slug inevitably suffered some blows from its allies, but it did not care. "Good hit. Harder. Hit its weak spot below the navel." The physical pain had somewhat affected its mental state, and it began to yell to relieve the pain. This made Keys somewhat unhappy, and he was considering if he should accidentally miss once and hit the prismatic monster's skull, thus returning peace to this world. However, he chose to forgive it in the end. After all, the act of beating up my teammate was really damaging to one's character. Moreover, it was not worth it to become enemies with the spirit of the soul-binding pagoda over such a small matter. Thus, Keys continued to focus on his mission of beating up the minced meat, and he pretended not to hear the shameful nonsense that the spirit of the soul-binding pagoda was shouting due to the imbalance of its senses. At the same time, in order to increase the efficiency of his hammering, he added some additional work to each blow. Dispelling touch. Thanks to the inheritance of Sage Gith, Keys actually possessed a rather shocking talent in psionic abilities. Coupled with the advantage of his soul as a mutated dragon, his spirit domain value, the total amount of spirit energy he could use, far exceeded that of ordinary spirit creatures. Although Keys didn't have many opportunities to practice, most of the time, using spells was enough. The psionic skills that he could master were far from the level of a master. However, he still managed to learn simple psionic skills like dispelling touch. Moreover, because his spiritual points were much higher than other psionicists, he did not have to worry about running out of spiritual points when he used dispelling touch continuously. Every time he swung the dragon head warhammer, he added a dispelling touch to it. Every time he raised the dragon head warhammer, the mountain-like weapon would be covered in a layer of crimson mist. When it made intimate contact with Barzub's body, the haze would disappear. Only when Keyes raised the dragon head warhammer again would the dragon head warhammer be covered in a layer of crimson. Although it was the traditional craft of Gith Yankee and Gith Zelly to fuse physical and psionic attacks into one, no one in the multiverse had ever done what Keyes did today. Originally, his every blow could break the connections between a large number of material molecules on Barzub's body. When he added dispelling touch to his attack, every blow could increase the size of the wound by at least a third. Just like radiation, every time the dragon head warhammer gnawed a piece of Barzub's flesh, a large piece of necrotic tissue would spread out around it. This was because dispelling touch had directly broken down a certain substance that made up Barzub's flesh. The things that were dispelled each time were not the same, and naturally caused a large area of necrosis in his body. 1.2 points. Sand accumulates into a tower, and armpits make a fur coat. These necrotic spots gradually connected together. The skin of the winged insect sovereign's true body finally became unable to provide any protection for its body. When Keyes smashed the surface for the last time, countless cracks instantly burst open. It was like an uncracked eggshell. If one considered that his true body was in the form of a soft slug, it would be more accurate to say that Barzub had turned into a soft-shelled egg that had been soaked in vinegar for many days. But no matter what, it could not hide the fact that Keyes had coincidentally opened Barzub's true body. Crackle! The winged insect sovereign's true body shattered into dust, and like falling leaves, it rustled and fell into the turbulent ocean vortex below. What replaced it was a dark red liquid blob that was as round as an egg and looked like a slime. Keyes was a little confused. Even with his soul in the state of a quantum observer and his knowledge reserves that ordinary creatures could not imagine, he still could not recognize what that strange blob of liquid was. More importantly, was Barzub the winged insect sovereign dead after turning into such a state? After all, ever since the Batsu people had settled down in the 9 prisons of Bader, there had never been a lord of pure devil blood who had been killed. That included the infamous Pay the Bill operation. Although a few lords had died during the political changes and riots in the 9 prisons of Bader, those lords were not pure devils. Unintentionally, he seemed to have come into contact with a secret hidden in the depths of the multiverse, and his quantum soul seemed to have sensed it. The demons of the lower realm are all creatures that have body and soul as one. I should have completely shattered Barzub's true body on the molecular level, and even his internal organs have been shaken into paste. His soul must have been severely damaged, and he might have even lost the most basic self-awareness. If an ordinary devil were to suffer such a blow, he would definitely be deader than dead. But this is Barzub after all, a devil lord with the status of a lord of hell. I can't let my guard down. Thinking of this, Keyes temporarily stopped, but his vigilance was at the highest level. At the same time, his soul in the state of a quantum observer began to operate at full power, attempting to use a special method of observation to analyze the various information contained in the strange blob of liquid. Know yourself and know your enemy, and you will never be defeated. Although Keyes had acted like a brute who only knew how to swing a sledgehammer, as an orderly and rational blue dragon, most of the time he would follow the way of planning before acting. There are very few exceptions. At this moment, the strange blob of liquid underwent some changes. Barzub's true body had originally fused with the soul-binding tower, but now that Barzub's true body had collapsed into a blob of liquid, it naturally separated from the soul-binding tower. Without the support of the Lord of Hell's magic power, the huge pyramid-shaped building rapidly fell into the sea. The prismatic monster created by the spirit of the soul-binding tower which had almost been accidentally squashed by Keys, was also dragged into the sea by the soul-binding tower. But just a second before it fell into the sea, the spirit of the soul-binding tower seemed to have gone crazy. It actually controlled the half-dead prismatic monster, and with a whoosh, it darted towards the blob of dark red liquid floating in the air. Barzub's relic should be inherited by me. When it shouted this sentence, the prismatic monster's head intentionally or unintentionally tilted towards Keys, who was in deep thought, as if it was declaring its rightful right. Oomph. Keys's incarnation of the essence golem snorted coldly in a very human-like manner. At the same time, raised the dragon head warhammer again. I forgot to tell you before, there are a total of 3 ways to destroy magic crystals, and I know all of them. Chapter 1039. There were 3 suggested ways to destroy Clinchinian, or broken magic crystal. Firstly, he could summon Tyr, the god of justice, or other divine powers that were good and lawful. If they answered the summon and saw the broken magic crystal, they would be more than happy to shatter the divine artifact that was pushing the multiverse into chaos and evilness. Secondly, which was what Quest had revealed to the spirit of the Binding Spirit Tower, Clinchinian could be destroyed by the 7 kind-hearted great liches and a powerful blazing divine servant, as long as they could find the original creation ritual and perform it in reverse. However, this would destroy all the great liches and expel the heavenly race. Thirdly, if the broken magic crystal could be wrapped in Shar's dark cloak, or if it was thrown into the center of eternal blaze by a certain saint or a senior-rank priest, the broken magic crystal would be shattered. And now, what Quest was going to put into practice was the 3rd way to destroy Clinchinian. Although he did not have Shar's dark cloak, and he had nothing to do with the gods whose divine title was the sun, he could simulate the environment at the center of eternal blaze. Yes, he was going to use Messenger of Peace. With the mice energy core inside the body of the essence golem, it was much easier for Keys to perform the spell that was defined as Messenger of Peace than for other people, just like how he performed the unorthodox legendary spells like Magic Theft. Also, his soul was in the quantum state, and he could perform equivalent exchanges by controlling the quantum fluctuations. He could directly exchange the activation energy needed for the spell and the materials needed for Messenger of Peace to the multiverse. Therefore, almost instantly, a dazzling cluster of light appeared in front of the dragonhead hammer that Keys raised. Had it not been for the restraint of the powerful magnetic field, Messenger of Peace would have been activated the moment it appeared. The closest object to this dangerous light was the dragonhead warhammer, which had its own consciousness. Quest, who was holding the handle of the warhammer, sensed the tremors and knew that his weapon was not as calm as it appeared to be. Calm down, Keys comforted Hammer. The reason he waited for that moment was to wait for the Megalosaurus to retreat to a safe area. After all, a killer move like Peace Envoy didn't have the ability to identify friend or foe. It only had a relatively safe damage radius for reference. The clockwork Megalosaurus did not drop the ball either. After retreating from the pile driver post on Barzub's face, it immediately left the Lord of Hell, who had turned into a strange liquid. Seeing that the clockwork Megalosaurus was out of danger, Keys immediately summoned a portal. When he entered the Spirit Pagoda and instigated the Spirit Pagoda spirit to rebel, he had recorded the corresponding coordinates and parameters. He also left some information on the blazing crystal that he gave to the Spirit Pagoda spirit. Extending his arm forward, the messenger of peace that was bound to the dragonhead warhammer by the magnetic field was pushed into the portal. Then, Keys closed the portal again. Rumble. The sound of an explosion suddenly rang out, accompanied by a violent gale. However, before that, what came first was still the baptism of heat radiation, neutron currents, and other kinds of rays. However, considering that it was only to kill a Spirit Pagoda spirit, Keys deliberately suppressed the yield of the messenger of peace this time. He limited the range of the explosion to 20 kilometers, and the explosion lasted no more than 20 seconds. Of course, in those 20 seconds, the the spirit pagoda spirit, who was at the center of the explosion, would suffer the same treatment as if it were at the center of eternal blaze. After only a few seconds, the blazing crystal that the spirit pagoda spirit resided in was vaporized, and the spirit pagoda spirit, which had turned into a virtual state again, only lasted for a short while at most before it was persuaded to leave this world by the messenger of peace. When the explosion took place, because it had been tempered by Lord Despat earlier, the spirit pagoda exploded into pieces like a gigantic bomb and splashed out in all directions. Thankfully, in the battle area, except for Keys's golem that was still standing in midair, even the clockwork megalosaurus had hidden at a safe distance. Keys's golem that was entirely made of refined gold and mithril, on the other hand, couldn't have been more solid. Whether it was the high-temperature radiation, the rays, the particles, or the splashing shrapnel, even if they could cause damage, the liquid metal could repair the damage in the next second. After confirming that the spirit pagoda spirit that was jumping randomly had been destroyed, Keys casually summoned a few elemental elders from the smoke elemental plane. Those elemental creatures like to collect all kinds of smoke. After the Peacekeeper exploded, it would produce a mushroom cloud that contained a large amount of radioactive dust, which was very popular with the smoke elemental elders. Even without Keys's order, they took the initiative to wrap all the dust into their bodies, and then carried this sincere gift back to the inner layer of the elemental plane. Killing the spirit pagoda spirit, even if he summoned the smoke elemental to clean up the battlefield, only took a little more than a minute. During this time, Keys had been paying attention to the strange liquid that Barzub had turned into after his death. But just now, when the smoke elemental elders opened the portal, Keys noticed that the liquid moved. Originally, he thought that it had given itself away. The reason why Keys summoned the smoke elemental elders was to see if the liquid would consciously follow them to escape to the inner layer of the elemental plane. For this reason, Keys had prepared a few spatial restriction spells in advance. However, what he didn't expect was that when the smoke elemental elder opened the portal, the strange liquid moved. However, it was not as Keys had expected. Instead, it kept trembling and accelerating, rushing to the sky of the Ashes world. Borrow it from the astral world? Keys wondered. The exquisite magic statue body was like a floating cloud, and there were very few places that could not be stepped on. Seeing that the strange liquid was about to get out of his control, he naturally kept rising to the sky. In the process, Keys also used evocation, enchantment, incantation, and necromancy spells to bombard the liquid. However, those spells did not seem to have any effect. Even a powerful instant death spell like Finger of Death only caused a little bit of corruption in the liquid, and it was immediately expelled by the liquid. That strange liquid seemed to be possessed and rushed out of the atmosphere of the Ash world with one mind. Chapter 1040. The Slough of the Winged Insect, Lord Barzub rushed out of the atmosphere. Keys followed the strange liquid closely, always on guard against it developing consciousness and escaping behavior. But in fact, it did not do anything like that. It seemed that it just wanted to fly out of the Ash world and enter the astral world. This thing is not right. In the process of following it, Keys had been observing it, not resting for a moment. With the help of gravitational waves, logically speaking, there shouldn't be anything in this world that Quest couldn't see. However, not long after they rushed out of the atmosphere of the Ash world, the gravitational waves fed back from the liquid showed a slight disturbance, and there was a tendency for it to become more and more intense. This was because its own gravitational force was also changing. Gravitational force was a kind of basic force related to the mass of an object. The gravitational force of the blood-red liquid had changed, but its volume and mass had not changed significantly. Could it be that the density is constantly increasing? Quest pondered. While he was thinking about this problem, a meteorite floating around the Ash world suddenly crashed into the liquid. And this was just the beginning. The astral world was not a complete vacuum, and there was a large amount of matter in this domain. Although there were no astral treasures, such as the bodies of fallen gods around a material plane like the Ash World, there was no lack of fragments that escaped from the Ash World or other material planes. It could even be said that there were many of them. With the first meteorite crashing into the liquid, there was the second, the third, the fourth. Keyes destroyed some of them, but compared to the number of meteorites attracted by it, it was just a drop in the ocean. Whether it was the astral world material fragments as small as dust, or the astral world material condensation as large as meteorites, they all rushed toward the liquid one after another. Like swallows returning to their nest, or eagles returning to the valley, it was getting more and more intense and continuous. If one had to use more vivid words to describe this scene, then it was as if someone had lit a torch in the star boundary, and the stardust, and even stardust were like moths, all of them fluttering towards it without any regard for their own safety. Good heavens! Keyes could not help but secretly click his tongue. His golem avatar had also felt the attraction from the strange liquid and began to move toward it involuntarily. Is this the real Chibaku Tensei? He complained in his heart. However, his next move was very decisive. In order to counteract the increasing gravitational force, as it absorbed more matter, the mass of liquid gradually turned into a spherical shape. The increase in mass brought about a stronger gravitational force. The arcane golem kept accelerating and circling around the new star that kept increasing in size, relying on centrifugal force to prevent itself from being captured. In the process, Keyes constantly collided with the astral world material that was constantly rushing toward the gravitational anomaly. Moreover, more and more astral world material was attracted to him. He felt like he was swimming in syrup. Bang! Suddenly, Keyes collided with something, and even the golem avatar was hit with a huge dent. Keyes suddenly realized this. Fortunately, his golem avatar was controlled by a quantum soul. If it were an ordinary thick-skinned construct creature, it would not be so sensitive to its own body. At the same time, he stretched out his hand and immediately grabbed the spherical soil clod with a diameter of 4 or 5 yards that collided with him. Like a hydraulic clamp, his fingers crushed the stardust that wrapped the outermost periphery of the spherical object, revealing the crystal-clear core. Oh, an unexpected gain. I've heard that some powerful spellcasters would roam the astral world from time to time in order to find these casting materials that are very expensive in the material plane. Keyes saw at a glance that the soil clod that collided with him was actually a diamond of quite a shocking diameter. However, this was just an unexpected gain and did not make him very excited. Previously, in order to find the gravitational slingshot device, he had also roamed the astral world for a long time, and during that time, he had also obtained some similar things. In the multiverse, a famous red robe association of mages had once captured a diamond comet with a diameter of several kilometers in the astral world. Since then, the association had never worried about the casting materials such as diamonds. His eyelids were not that shallow. He just felt a little puzzled. Logically speaking, the closer it was to the material plane, the rarer such treasures hidden in the astral world would be. So this diamond might not have originally been around the Ash's world. In other words, it might have been captured by the strange liquid from other places in the astral world through a strong gravitational force. This was not something that could not be understood. In fact, spellcasters or scholars who had a certain understanding of the spatial knowledge of various realms in the multiverse knew that there were some folds in the space of the astral world. Many recorded interplane travel spells were actually used to pass through these folds to achieve the purpose of quickly moving to other planes. The appearance of the Diamond Comet, which was unlikely to appear around the Ash's world, made Keyes realize that the gravitational anomaly caused by the strange liquid might have penetrated the folds in the astral world, which was definitely not good news. When he realized this, it was actually a little too late. The sudden increase in gravitational force made the essence golem involuntarily fall toward the center of the strange liquid. The astral matter around him that was originally like syrup suddenly increased by an unknown amount, as if it had suddenly condensed into a certain solid form. Keys wanted to forcibly break free from the restraint, but more and more matter around him began to squeeze toward him. In order to maintain its integrity, the essence golem had to work hard to shrink and slowly become the most suitable sphere to resist the pressure. Did I really get hit by the Chibaku Tensei? In an instant, Keys could not help but be a little shocked. He did not expect to suddenly encounter such a blow. It was like a character in a certain hot-blooded manga who was restrained by a seal at the last moment. After many attempts to break free from the restraint, Keys decisively chose to use his backup plan. The quantum soul instantly disappeared from the essence golem and then appeared in the body of the megalosaurus in the Ashes world. Chapter 1041. In the beginning of the universe, chaos was everywhere, and demons came uninvited. They represented chaos. Time had not yet appeared, and due to the nature of chaos, the demons slaughtered each other in every part of the universe. Such a chaotic situation was unbearable for the entire universe, so another force to fight against it appeared: order. The war between order and the demons began. The newborn gods of order wore armor made of pure order power and took up weapons for their ideals. Then, they launched a fierce attack on the demons. This war lasted for countless centuries. For this, the gods of order created the Holy Bible to record their achievements. They also created time because they wanted to know how long it would take to achieve the final victory. As if chanting, a tall creature about 13 feet tall compared to Keys, it was actually quite small, stood beside Keys, narrating meticulously. But he added in the end, "Unfortunately, most of the above are lies." His skin and hair were of a dark color. Even though he had color, standing there in broad daylight, he still gave off a dark and abnormal feeling. For those who like to chisel hard lines, this tall humanoid creature could even be said to be quite handsome, like a bright thunderbolt. As to whether this description was handsome or dangerous, it was entirely up to the observer. But until now, there were actually not many people in the multiverse who looked directly at him. His pupils flashed with a blood-red light that matched the 9 prisons of Bader very well, and there was a pair of small dark red horns on his head. His clothes were gorgeous, but not flashy, and the colors were mainly red and black. Just this one piece of clothing, its actual value might be equivalent to the total wealth of a material plane. Moreover, this did not include the value of the accessories he carried with him. He always held a ruby scepter in his hand, which was inlaid with countless gorgeous gemstones, and each of them contained magical energy that could cause the world to change rapidly. Although, as the owner of the scepter, he was actually powerful enough, at least in the eyes of most of the beings in the multiverse. And in fact, some powerful good gods or demon lords of the bottomless abyss had actually prayed that he would not be so powerful, but he always adhered to the idea of being prepared is to be safe. After all, this was the precious experience that Astamores had used to secure the #1 position in the 9 prisons of Bader for so many years. No matter how treacherous the enemy was, as long as he was prepared, he would always be able to remain as still as a mountain, and the final victory would always be on his side. It was due to this reason that apart from some lunatics in the bottomless abyss or chaos sea or fanatics who worshipped certain good gods, very few people in the entire multiverse were willing to go against such a powerful being. Keys naturally did not intend to provoke the Astamores for no reason, especially when he had just entered adulthood and crawled out of the gravitational slingshot. It really caught him off guard when he encountered the Lord of 9 Hells. This is quite sudden. Keys spoke to the Astamores in the infernal language. It was unknown whether he was talking about the Lord of 9 Hells' sudden appearance in the Ashen world, or whether he was commenting on the fact that the Lord of 9 Hells had exposed himself. Chapter 1042. Japan Province, Zhejiangjin, Yashigaki. A dream of golden millet in an octopus pot, the summer moon on the horizon. Sitting on a mat in the courtyard, gently fanning a military fan made of iron and leather, listening to the gurgling of water and the occasional cries of startled deer, Mitaru could not help but close his eyes in comfort and he blurted out words that matched his state of mind. 50 years of experience in Zhejiangjin had allowed this humble son of a humble family to climb step by step to the position of chief inspector of the talent market. And his family had also advanced many times, becoming the only wealthy family in Zhejiangjin, one of the aristocratic families in the entire Japan province. A person born for 100 years is nothing more than this, Mitaru thought with some pride. However, he did not blur out this sentence, but kept it in his heart. After all, as a regional supervisor of the scale of perpetual order, he was naturally aware of the pervasive ability of the Chamber of Commerce's spies. Thinking of this, Mitaru's squinted eyes widened, and he felt a little thirsty. Fortunately, the water in the iron kettle had been boiled, and he could use it to make tea to relieve the heat. A cup of tea, a piece of charcoal. My spring seems to be frozen. Perhaps because he had lived like a prince for so long. Even when drinking a cup of tea, Mitaru would leisurely recite a few famous poems in his heart, adding a touch of elegance. This was a joy that belonged to this old man. However, today's joy was not like in the past, when it accompanied Mitaru from dawn to dusk. Master, Lord Qingjun of the Maeda family has already disembarked at Great Blasphemy Port. A servant ran into the courtyard and hurriedly reported the news to Mitaru. Although the servant had already taken off his wooden clogs before running into the courtyard, wearing a silk footbag to step on the cobblestone path without making much noise, the news he reported after kneeling on one knee still shocked Mitaru. How could it be so fast? Mitaru narrowed his eyes. His old eyes were instantly bloodshot. But this abnormality was fleeting, and even the attendant with the surname Xiao, who was closest to him, did not notice it. Let's go to Great Blasphemy Port. Mitaru opened his mouth and spoke. And as he spoke, the old man in his 80s suddenly stood up, not at all like an old man of his age who was physically incapacitated. When he hurried past the servant, the latter had time to get up. However, as the attendant straightened his body, a line of blood had appeared on his neck at some point. Thud! A large head with hair tied up in a bun fell onto the cobblestone path. Then, the head rolled into the harmonious stream of flowing goblets that was specially created by the craftsman. In the end, it tarnished the beautiful view of the courtyard. At the top of the Tinsho Pavilion in the center of the stone wall, a gray-robed elite desert elf ninja with 2 scimitars on his waist and a long gun on his back. This was a special profession trained by the scale of perpetual order to do as the Romans do. The purpose of their existence was to supervise the various chambers of commerce in the Japanese province. He quickly took the long gun in front of him and looked for the target with the help of the magic spell engraved on the scope. However, what he did not expect was that in the next second, he felt a sudden pain in his chest. An unbearable salty smell rushed from his chest to his throat and neck. About an inch of the sharp tip of the sword protruded from his chest. The magic chain armor he wore did not provide any protection. Similarly, the tranquility suit on his body did not allow him to completely blend in with the environment. "I'm very sorry." An old voice rang in the desert elf's ears. It sounded as if the voice was as guilty as it sounded. "My craftsmanship has not been polished. It's very rough. I made you suffer." Screech, the man wielding the sword, swung the weapon hard, and the elite desert elf ninja's body was split into 2 in an instant. Mitaru put the sword back into its sheath and narrowed his eyes again. It was strange that his narrowed eyes did not look like an ordinary old man who was exhausted. Instead, he looked like a ferocious, man-eating tiger that was about to pounce on its prey. At this moment, in Mitaru's eyes, more than a dozen places in the stone wall lit up with a bloody light. There were also roars and sounds of fighting in some places. It was obvious that some of the retainers were not capable enough and were not able to kill the ninja smoothly. A bunch of trash. Seeing this scene, Mitaru could not help but let out a cold snort. He then waved the military fan in his hand, which was painted with the eternal blaze on one side and the crescent moon on the other. As the fan was waved gently, the hidden sentries who received the message blew the special bamboo whistles they carried with them. The whistles that sounded like whining instantly resounded throughout the stone wall. A large number of slave warriors wearing armor, holding iron cannons and long sabers at their waists, ran from the camp to the walls of the stone wall. They had all received the alarm of a bandit attack, even though their minds were full of question marks. In this day and age, there were still pirates or bandits who dared to attack a large stronghold of the scale of perpetual order. The speed at which they rushed to their respective posts was indeed not the slightest bit fake. Seeing that the stone wall was already armed like a turtle shell, Mitaru waved the military fan again with a special technique. This time, it was Neo Jin's turn to react under the small hill where the stone wall was located. Some of the retainers hiding in the city received the signal and immediately created chaos at the location marked by the Patriarch, killing people on the street, igniting hidden gunpowder, casually throwing silver judges. There were all kinds of strange things that were different. In short, most of the defenders on the stone wall saw the chaos at the foot of the mountain. Although they only saw the chaos and did not know why the chaos was happening, this did not stop them from raising their vigilance and guarding against the bandits who could appear at any time. Huff and puff, seeing the chaos inside and outside the city, Mitaru, the instigator, could not help but sigh. Then, he sang a short poem like before to liven things up. Scattering rice is also a sin. Let the chickens fight. As the poem ended, Mitaru, who looked no different from an old man, suddenly widened his eyes. His eyes were clear and his mind was clear. Young man, after witnessing such a soul-stirring battle, how could he not yearn for it? He said to himself with certainty, unlike the guilty tone he had when he killed the elite ninja. This is my own choice, not because I was attracted by the rice that fell from someone's fingers. Ha ha, it's just that the world doesn't know. It's just that the world doesn't know. Chapter 1043. Walking out of the desecration wharf, he looked at the mountains outside Jiangjin City in the distance. Above the huge stone walls, the elegant oars and heavenly guards towered into the clouds. However, most people didn't know that the appearance of these beautiful buildings was not only because of artistic beauty, but also because of military principles. Of course, there were still people who knew. Glancing at the destination of this trip and rolling his eyes at the sun in the sky, Keizen Asada yawned, pulled out the small folding fan clipped to the round collar around his neck, and fluttered it to get some cool air for himself. However, the words on the folding fan were a bit strange. The sun rises and spirals and the dry sand rustles down, which had nothing to do with the cool charm. Reading or looking at it made people feel a little anxious and hot. In addition, Keizen Asada was wearing a scarlet hunting suit. From a distance, he looked like a raging fire walking in the human world. We didn't take the airship route, nor did we choose the newly laid railway here. Instead, we took an old-fashioned sailboat. Moreover, the boat was neither the Zhuin Imperial ship nor the anchored warship. It was just an ordinary 1,000-rock boat used to transport soy sauce. Keizen Asada said with exultation. He didn't care about his attendant's surname at all. He just bowed his head silently, abiding by the attendant's code of silence. However, in the end, we arrived at Jiangjin City 3 days earlier than planned. Ha ha ha! The reason is that we set off a whole week earlier. The early bird gets the worm. The ancients were right. The attendant's face was still expressionless, although he actually wanted to expose his young master's self-comfort. It was clearly half a month before the departure, because he went to Hulu Huaiji with his friends and lost the travel expenses given by the master. So he had to set off in advance and took the ordinary 1,000-rock boat from Chuyin City to Jiangjin City. How did it turn out that he was the one who planned the strategy first? However, he didn't do that in the end. Not only because the attendant should never talk about the master's rules, but also because as an old servant of the Asada family, he knew that the master was the leader of the eccentrics in Chuyin City when he was young. His young master's words and actions were like those eccentrics. There was nothing wrong with a son resembling his father. Of course, he is still an old servant. Although he can see the young master of the main family on the Thousand-Stone boat, he can't let him ruin the reputation of the Asada family when they are about to do serious business in Jiangjin. He paid out of his own pocket to hire a rickshaw for the penniless Kazan Asada to drive him. When the young master, who was wearing a scarlet hunting outfit, got into the carriage, he followed the rickshaw silently, 1 or 2 steps behind the driver. The swaying bells tinkled and sang, and the wheels creaked as they rolled along the flagstones of the Jiangjin road. The master and servant were like ordinary businessmen who came to the largest talent market in Japan. After leaving the torii at the Daizao port, they went straight to the main road in Jiangjin City. The Yayoi family's Shi Yuan was located at the end of this road. Therefore, any merchant who knew the ropes would first head to the office of the Scales of Eternity Chamber of Commerce's inspector to receive today's talent statistics, unless they send employees to the city to investigate the situation in advance. The merchants really couldn't leave the court bulletin if they wanted to obtain more information about the market. However, Kazan Asada didn't come to buy things. He came to inquire about a confused account. Many days ago, the auditing agency of the Scale of Perpetual Order in Japan found that there was a strange deficit in the talent market of Jiangjin City. More than 50 years ago, a Rakshasa demon was sentenced to the penal camp when His Excellency Keys went to the bottomless abyss. Later, he was brought back to the Ashes world to serve his sentence. This was very strange. First of all, the Rakshasa demon was also a kind of evil spirit. Even if he had received super intensive labor in the penal camp and his body was badly damaged, he had only served for more than 50 years. He shouldn't have died of exhaustion. Second of all, even if the Rakshasa demon was a special kind of devil that was not recognized by the purebred Batsu, after their death, their souls would still return to the 9 prisons of Bader and wait for 99 years to be reborn. Jiangjin City also reported according to this statement, saying that because they didn't expect the Rakshasa demon to die suddenly, they didn't have time to set up a magic circle to bind the soul, and they were willing to bear all the consequences and punishments. However, more than 2 months ago, a big event happened in the Ashes world that many people had heard of, but only a few people knew about. Since that event, it was impossible for the evil spirits, especially the devils, to return to the underworld after their death in this material plane. Therefore, the Scale of Perpetual Order ordered the Asada family, who was in charge of Chuyun City in Japan Province, to go to Jiangjin City in the name of routine audit. Keiji Asada, on the other hand, directly ordered his youngest son, Kaimasa Asada, who was given a name of absurd and bizarre, not respecting his father's name, and quite strange by himself, to go straight to Jiangjin to investigate the whole story. The reason why Keiji Asada chose Kizumi Asada as a candidate was that his youngest son was named Jun. Although he was quite like his father and did some absurd things since he was a child, he had never done anything that didn't match his name. Kizumi, Kizumi, Kizumi. Hulu Haiji lost the money, but he still paid without any excuses. If he didn't have money to take the fast and convenient transportation, he took the cheap and long old-fashioned Thousand Rock boat. He set off a week in advance and arrived 3 days in advance. Although it was all kinds of trivial things, it was still obvious. The rickshaw was running on the road. Kizumi Asada sat in the car, crossing his legs and waving the folding fan painted with the words, "The sun rises and spirals, the dry sand rustles down," while squinting at the yashing stone wall standing on the distant mountain. At some point, he took out an iron ball similar to a literary treasure and played with it carefully in his palm. It's just a routine audit, not a visit. Why do you have to make such a big scene? Unless Kizumi Asada laughed, which made the old servant who was striding beside the rickshaw look at him. However, the young master of the Asada family didn't pay attention to him. He just closed the folding fan in his hand with a swish sound. There was a flash of vermilion on the folding fan made of good bamboo, and soon there was no sign of it. At this moment, the old servant was nowhere to be seen. It was unknown if he had run to the forest beside the road to relieve himself, or if he had gone to commit murder and robbery. Chapter 1044. We've arrived. Stop the car. Sitting in the rickshaw, Kizumi Asada took a deep breath and said to the coachman. The coachman sneered and replied, "Sir, not yet, bang." Without any more hints, when Kizumi Asada inserted the folding fan behind the round collar of his hunting suit, a gun slipped from his cuff into his palm. He pulled the trigger without hesitation. The bullet flew out and directly smashed the head of the rickshaw driver. The latter fell to the ground, and the rickshaw stopped suddenly. Then it lost its balance because it ran over the body of the rickshaw driver and suddenly overturned on the side of the road. At the moment of shooting, Kizumi Asada jumped out of the seat of the rickshaw. The sleeves of his hunting suit swayed, like a butterfly dancing in the flowers. After a few seconds, he was 7 or 8 steps away from the overturned rickshaw, and then he stepped on the ground again. After his head exploded, the coachman's corpse also underwent some changes. The clothes on his body didn't change much, except for a short knife that fell out of his chest. The biggest change was his body. The coachman had turned from a human into a grayish-white humanoid creature. He looked like an unfinished creature. His limbs were abnormally thin, and there wasn't a single strand of hair on his body. He was a shapeshifter, although his head connected to his neck had been smashed by the bullet, so the classic noseless face couldn't be seen. But from his insect-like feet and four-fingered palms, it could be judged that he was actually an adult shapeshifter. Shapeshifters like to infiltrate society to gather wealth and influence instead of building their own cities. Young shapeshifters usually infiltrated goblin or orc tribes to practice. When they were skilled, they would go to more complicated societies such as elves, dwarves, and humans. Compared with being a leader and attracting attention, they preferred to be a behind-the-scenes manipulator or use multiple identities to manipulate influential citizens or even entire guilds. From the perspective of pure good and evil, this race was actually not too evil. Some shapeshifters even did things like raising orphans, supporting the elderly, and even sacrificing their lives for the monarch as loyal subjects because of excessive indulgence in role-playing. But these cases couldn't hide their nature of only caring about themselves and regarding others as playthings to manipulate and deceive. In particular, most shapeshifters like to lurk in human society to satisfy their various desires. Shapeshifters couldn't breed with other shapeshifters, but they could have offspring with other humanoid creatures, and half of the offspring would be shapeshifters. Shapeshifters who abuse their talents to achieve evil and sick purposes were the most notorious in the world. They were also the culprits that dragged the reputation of the whole race. But in terms of proportion, such culprits accounted for at least half of the shapeshifters. This was because if a creature could change its appearance, it would be very easy for it to escape capture. In other words, the cost of committing crimes for this species was very low. With this prerequisite and the fact that they didn't have any moral standards, it wasn't hard to understand why the mutated species had such a high crime rate. Therefore, in several planes ruled by the scale of eternal order, there was a specific law for shapeshifters. Shapeshifters living in the jurisdiction of the Chamber of Commerce needed to register in advance, and then they could enjoy the corresponding rights and interests of residents. Otherwise, any unregistered, wild shapeshifters would be killed without mercy. Kizu Asada had another hidden meaning. Because of his character and talent, his father, Kizu Asada, spent a lot of money to ask someone to give him the eye of truth when he was young, so that he could see through most of the fabrications and puzzles in the world. After riding in the rickshaw for such a long time, Kizu Asada observed the shape-shifting coachman from head to toe several times. Although there was a registration number of the scale of eternal order written in invisible magic ink on the coachman's neck, if the serial number was substituted into a special verification formula, it could not get an integer result at all. Obviously, the serial number was also forged. In addition, because of his sharp eyes, Kizumi Asada had actually seen what happened at the top of the Heavengar Pavilion in the Yayoi Stone enclosure. He had seen the existence of the underworld, who wore the skin of a harmless old Japanese man, but had actually turned into a Rakshasa, or evil beast ghost, killing the desert elf ninja with a saber. Then, the true identity of a shape-shifting coachman was about to be revealed. There was no doubt that the monster must be an assassin. As for whether he was bought or not, it didn't matter. The point was that if he violated the rules, he had to die. I told you to stop. It means that you have already arrived at your destination. Without looking back, Kizu Asada strode to the gate of Meishinshi Pavilion, ignoring the shape-shifting monster behind him. A noseless head slowly grew out of the body of the shape-shifting monster. The monster gradually regained his consciousness, and his hand slowly reached for the knife. However, bang, there was another gunshot. Kizu Asada just stretched his arm back and pulled the trigger again. Then, the shape-shifting monster repeated the scene not long ago. The head exploded into many pieces of red and white debris. However, this time, he didn't hide his real head as before. He just transformed a piece of flesh on his neck into the head of a human coachman. In other words, he was really dead this time. 7 steps away, the gun is fast. Within 7 steps, the gun is accurate and fast. Kizu Asada laughed and spoke his true thoughts. That was the reason why he had never deliberately practiced the katana technique or the katana technique. However, it didn't affect him. Kizu Asada's killing power was the best in the Asada family, even surpassing his father, who was famous for using an enchanted red spear. Otherwise, he wouldn't have been responsible for checking the accounts in Jiangjin this time. As for why he said that he was the best in killing power, the reason was very simple. First, Kizu Asada's handgun was extremely well made and his skills were superb. Second, he had an excellent bulletproof vest. Generally, only he could hit others, but others couldn't do anything to him. Bang! After another 2 steps, Kizu Asada was less than 3,000 yards away from the Yayoi Isthmus. He slapped the iron ball that he had been holding in his left hand on his body. Armor ball, Hazora! As if it was alive, the iron ball covered Kizu Asada's body like mercury, forming a Wazera-style armor with various gorgeous patterns, providing protection for Kizu Asada's body. This was a relatively novel liquid armor. Its prototype was the Fanatic armor. The reason why it had the effect of liquid metal was that the flesh had been integrated with the metal material of the armor. Although the cost of this type of Fanatic armor was dozens of times higher than that of the ordinary model, Kizu Asada did not hesitate to sign an IOU with his family and pay for it out of his own pocket. He admitted that the reason why he bought this armor was that it was very handsome. Chapter 1045. It turned out that Kizumi Asada was worried too much, until he walked to the outside of the Yayoi stone step by step and stood in front of the Shama stone engraved with the words, "Stop." The Dai slave warriors on the city wall just aimed at him, but no one really shot a fatal bullet at him. Of course, this may also be due to the words Kizumi Asada and restrained by Mei on the 2 flags behind him. However, there was something unusual. Originally, the Shama stone was the place where businessmen bought the newspaper, and there were so many tourists every day. But now, there was no one else in this place except Kizumi Asada, who was wearing the madman armor in the style of Hazura. Open the gate and accept the investigation. If you disobey, you will die. Don't say that I didn't warn you. Don't listen to me, sir. Kizumi Asada raised his hand and pointed at the city wall, shouting. On the left and right sides of his madman armor, there were dovetail board and sandalwood board of different sizes, which didn't play much of a protective role, just like an allegro hanging on the chest. However, because of his movement, the 2 boards collided with the armor, making a click-click sound, which was very interesting. On the city wall, some Dai slave warriors who didn't understand the situation or were careless were even amused by Kizumi Asada's behavior. Although they knew that he was from the Asada family in Chuyin City, so they wouldn't easily start a fight with him, it didn't prevent them from thinking that this noble young master, who was wearing the flashy armor of the Japanese emperor, was actually an embroidered pillow in essence. Restrained by Mei, what a bold claim. However, how did Bai Mei retreat when he wore the armor but didn't have a sword? Was he laughed to death? The answer was of course no. Moreover, those Dai slave warriors who guarded the gate because of Mataro's orders soon knew the reason. Seeing that the door was not open, Kizumi Asada was not annoyed. He smoothed his hands down from his pocket, as if he was smoothing his long beard. Then his palms grabbed the sandalwood board and the dovetail board respectively, and broke the rope tied on them. The two boards lightly knocked against each other, producing a crisp sound. The sandalwood board was thrown to the ground. In the next second, the sandalwood board, which was over a foot wide and 2 feet long, opened up layer by layer like a folded piece of paper, revealing the splicing formation hidden within. Kizumi Asada lifted his foot and stepped on it. The formation was activated. The white lines of the array suddenly gathered in one place, and in an instant, the two-dimensional image was pulled into a three-dimensional image by some kind of force. If anyone who had been to Rising Cloud City saw it, they would definitely recognize it at a glance. Wasn't this the mechanical cannon that stood at the top of Rising Cloud City's main gate and was named National Destroyer? When Kize Asada's foot left the ground, the three-dimensional image finally condensed into a solid entity and was magnified hundreds of times. The giant mechanical cannon that was named National Destroyer was actually borrowed from the city walls of Rising Cloud City by a piece of sandalwood. Accompanied by the creaking sound of gears, the National Destroyer cannon started to reload automatically. Do-die slave warriors on the city walls were all dumbfounded all of a sudden. Some flag captains reacted quickly and decisively. At this time, they had no time to be in awe of the Asada family in Rising Cloud City. They had to order their men to open fire in front of the enemy's formation. After all, even if they would be hunted down and killed by the Asada family, it would be better than being wronged by the National Destroyer cannon now. However, the order was still a little late. In addition to the sandalwood board, Kizumi Asada had just dropped a dovetail board. The latter was not thrown to the ground, but directly smashed on his Hazura fanatic armor. When the dovetail board was broken, another weapon sealed inside was also revealed. 6 barrels as thick as goose eggs, a rotating wheel driven by a motor, and a mortise and tenon part that matched the shoulder base of the fanatic armor. Kizumi Asada carried this rapid-fire, rotating gun named Dovetail on his shoulder. Boom, 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 boom. The sound like a god beating a drum was continuous. The magazine, engraved with spatial spell incantations, continuously transported egg-sized grenades into the barrel. With the rotation of the motor, these grenades were fired one by one. There were 6 barrels, and there was 1 tracer bullet in every 6 grenades. Even in the early morning, there would be a shining red tail line in the air, like a swaying dove's tail. This was the origin of the name of this weapon. Like raindrops hitting the mud, each dovetail grenade would smash a pit with a diameter of nearly 1 yard on the wall of Yashengshi Rampart. The clever flag captains of do-die slave warriors quickly ordered their men to withdraw from the wall. And the unwise ones, even they had no chance to set foot on this land again. They were directly crushed into dust by the grenades. Not only that, when Kizumi Asada carried the dovetail cannon and plowed through the wall of Yashengshi Rampart, the National Destroyer cannon summoned by him also completed the automatic reloading. Rumble accompanied by a thunderous sound. With the National Destroyer cannon as the center, the bluestone slabs on the ground within a radius of dozens of yards were suddenly shaken into striped cracks. The bluestone slabs near the center were even shattered into powder. The air was torn apart by the cannonball, and the invisible aura even condensed into a long line, directly penetrating the main gate of Yashengshi Rampart. And looking along this thin line of aura from the main gate of Yashengshi Rampart to the towering Tinsho Pavilion in the middle to the small mountain behind, everything could be seen at a glance. The cannonball fired from the National Destroyer cannon directly pierced through the Yashengshi Rampart's fortress and finally sank in the mountainside. After the first shot, the mechanical gears of the giant cannon once again creaked and reloaded by itself. However, despite its power, Kizumi Asada couldn't help but curl his lips. As Mr. Shea said before, Chuyin City's boldness is still too weak. Although this giant cannon is called National Destroyer, in fact, it can only tear a city apart at most. It's more realistic to call it City Destroyer. However, although Kizumi Asada liked to tell the truth, the person in charge of Yashengshi Rampart, or Mitaro, couldn't really turn a blind eye to the destruction caused by the National Destroyer cannon. His mansion, especially the Tianshou Pavilion that he had placed high hopes on, couldn't withstand the destruction of the next cannon. If the collapse of the country was allowed to happen again, the already crumbling Heaven's Guard Pavilion would most likely collapse into ruins. That's my only way out. Standing at the top of Tianshou Pavilion, Mataro's eyes were red, and his heart was surging. He had long known that what he had done was a big taboo. It was about a month ago that he made up his mind. He spent a large sum of money to have someone cut out the heart, liver, spleen, and stomach of the Rakshasa demon serving his sentence in the Zhejiangjin labor camp and transplanted them into his own body. Through this transformation, Mitaro seized the bloodline of the Rakshasa demon and turned himself from a human into a kind of demon. On the one hand, he did this to increase his dying lifespan. On the other hand, with the power of a demon, he could fulfill his long-cherished wish of witnessing the fierce battle between the Megalosaurus and Lord Keys in Zhejiangjin when he was young. On the other hand, he felt that if he became a demon, he might be more adapted to the environment of the future Ashes world, live better in this plane, and climb to a higher position to overlook the mediocre mortals. However, after all, what he thought was just what he thought, and his behavior did violate the rules set by the scale of perpetual order. There is nothing wrong with not violating the rules and following one's heart. The Chamber of Commerce would also give everyone the corresponding rights. If an individual dared to put himself outside the rules, the scale of perpetual order would always have only one attitude. No matter what the price, always prove that the rules are the rules. Therefore, Mitaro didn't take any chances. He even left a way out for himself. In Tianshou Pavilion, there was a gate between worlds array that was also made at high price, and it could connect to a town on the first floor of the 9 prisons of Bader, Avernus. If it were not for the fact that he had not fully adapted to the bloodline of the Rakshasa demon and could not bear to part with the life of pleasure in the Ashes world, he would have left for the 9 prisons of Bader and directly hid. Therefore, when he saw how Kizumi Asada defeated 100 demons and saw the scene of the national collapse cannon penetrating Yaishing Ishibashi, he immediately became anxious. The servants and retainers of the Yaishing family could be killed at will, and Yaishing Ishibashi could be bombed at will, and he would not feel the slightest heartache. But if Tianshou Pavilion with the gate between worlds was destroyed, Mitaro could only wait for death in the Ashes world. Of course, there was another possibility. He could try to commit suicide and then use the identity of a Rakshasa demon to wait in some unknown place in the 9 prisons of Bader for 99 years to be reborn. However, Mitaro did not want to do that. Fortunately, he did not do that. Otherwise, with the current problems in the Ashes world, he might really be dead. Who would be willing to die if they could live? Being forced into a corner, his body bent a lot in an instant, and all the strength and spirit of his whole body seemed to condense in one place. When a tiger humbles its momentum, it will attack. When a raccoon shrinks its body, it will take it. After completing the accumulation of momentum, the next second, Mitaro burst out all the accumulated strength, spirit like a bomb that suddenly exploded. In a flash, the guy appeared in front of Kizumi Asada, who was wearing the Hazura fanatic armor, and his robe was left on the top of Tianshou Pavilion. Mitaro's head had turned into the shape of a leopard, and the inverted curved fingers and the crazy roar of this beast-like evil demon showed his cruelty and evil nature without any doubt. Mitaro's inverted hand held a long knife, and with the help of the force of the sprint, he chopped at Kizumi Asada. At the same time, this insidious evil demon also used a spell-like ability similar to the immobilization spell, so that Kizumi Asada, who was hiding in the fanatic armor, could not move. Mitaro made up his mind to cut him in half, and then, of course, he would run away immediately. However, he seemed to have forgotten someone. After all, it was just a servant with a small surname who was not worth mentioning in his eyes. It was similar to his previous identity, but the nameless servant and Mitaro were not the same kind of people. Mitaro was not even a human being. Snap! 2 dark, obsidian-like palms instantly clasped together and clamped the more than 4 feet long narrow knife that was chopping downward. The short servant who was as muscular as a mountain rock, blocked the chop from a demon who was almost the same as a real Rakshasa demon. A little blood flowed out of the corner of his mouth. It seemed that it was not easy to rush from a distance and forcibly catch the knife. However, the blood was not red, but a gush of burning, black, shiny oil. Once upon a time in the world of ashes, a certain desert elf tribe that had almost been forgotten by everyone but could not really be buried in history created a biochemical beast named Blazing Shadow Beast by excavating the notes of an ancient soul-binding sorcerer. That kind of blazing shadow beast seemed to break the barrier between creatures and machines. Its appearance was similar to a tiger or a leopard, and its strength was not inferior to some gifted magic creatures. The energy it needed to survive could all be obtained by burning black oil in the biological furnace in its body. In theory, as long as the black oil tube was full, the blazing shadow beast, which was clearly a biochemical beast, could continue to operate like a machine. Later, this kind of blazing shadow beast was introduced by the scale of perpetual order and became a member of the fighting order for a period of time. Later, due to the continuous upgrade of war weapons, those blazing shadow beasts gradually left the fighting order of the Chamber of Commerce. However, the scale of perpetual order was a rule. If there was a mistake, there would be a punishment, and if there was a merit, there would be a reward. Some blazing shadow beasts who had made great achievements in the war got the opportunity to get rid of their identity as beasts and got the opportunity to evolve. With the help of more detailed and specific ancient soul binding masters' research notes, the half-lich Snade from the School of Necromancy, and the help of the Ogre Paru from the field of life science and the master of making voodoo potions, these blazing shadow beasts finally evolved into blazing shadow men. Their wisdom became no different from that of human beings. In the scale of perpetual order, in addition to being biological weapons, they had the opportunity to become other kinds of employees or do other things. The short old man, who had served Kazan Asada's family for decades and had been treated as a minor aristocrat, was a blazing shadow man usually. He was no different from ordinary people. Only when necessary, he would turn into a fighting machine. Compared with demons like Rakshasa, blazing shadow men who couldn't use spells were no match for them. However, they also had their own advantages. As long as the black oil tube was enough, their strength, speed, and even their own regeneration ability were not a problem. Maybe he really couldn't beat them, but this servant of blazing shadow man could still take a few attacks. The purpose of his accompanying this time was to increase the fault tolerance of Kazan Asada's curing 100 demons. As for the attack, Kazan Asada really had no problem. This was not breaking free from the state of immobilization spell. Kazan Asada saw that his servant blocked the fatal attack for him. Without any hesitation, he immediately took out 120% of his spirit to fight against the enemy. A folding fan popped out from the back of the neck of the whirlpool armor on his body. With a whoosh, it opened automatically. Extreme spell. Monster immobilization. A spell was sealed in this magic fan, which was given by a senior master of the scale of perpetual order. Its effect was similar to immobilization spell, but its range was wider, not only for humans. Even monsters could be immobilized. At the same time, due to its own supreme magic effect, as long as it was not a legendary monster, it could not be exempted from this immobilization effect, giving him a taste of his own medicine. This time, it was Kazan Asada's turn to immobilize Mitaro, who had been demonized by Rakshasa. Then, the youngest son of the Asada family used his best method, retreating and curing 100 demons. The dovetail, revolving cannon's bullets struck the monster, Mitaro, one after another. It didn't stop even after completely tearing him apart, until a soul prism carried by Kazan Asada lit up, which meant that it had captured the soul of the monster. Chapter 1046. Taka City is too salty, so we need fresh water. The more, the better. This was the catchphrase of Governor Emil of Taka City. The young man named Iger held a shovel in his hand as he walked through the misty factory path toward the freshwater purification workshop. Taka City was famous for its well salt, rock salt, lake rock, and specially processed powder salt. Based on the sale of table salt and industrial salt, it built the various frameworks and structures needed for a commercial city. Food from Spat, brocade from Wusong, machinery and skinned undead from Gnome City. This was a type of undead that covered skeletons with skin in order to not scare ordinary people. Or even wood from even more distant places, such as Ramsey's Wood, and various meat products from the island world. All of these things could be bought from various bazaars in the city. Although the price was not cheap, it was not expensive either. For Taka City, the only resources that the city had to produce on its own was fresh water other than various salts. In a city with a population of nearly 300,000, the cost of purchasing fresh water for daily use was too high for ordinary families to afford. Therefore, the various refining salt pans in Taka City were unlike those in other places. At most, their production waste was some brine, and the water vapor would not be wasted. Instead, it was sold to various freshwater production factories as a byproduct. There were only about 30 salt works in Taka City, but there were 400 to 500 freshwater production factories. Almost every block had a small factory that was dedicated to delivering the daily freshwater needed by the neighbors in the area. Such a small factory had to purchase filtration, secondary distillation, and condensing equipment in the early stages, as well as lay pipes to each household. In fact, the cost was not low. Not to mention ordinary civilians. Even some businessmen who ran businesses might not be able to afford it. Later, the scale of perpetual order provided a special low-interest loan for Taka City. Those who wanted to run this business would be able to obtain a loan of more than 10 gold drogs from the Chamber of Commerce, as long as they passed the examination and met certain conditions. It was not until the freshwater production factories in Taka City reached saturation point that each block had its own water supply factory that the special loan for the scale of perpetual order stopped operating. The first batch of small factories that were established had basically recovered their costs after 5 to 6 years of operation. This young man named Iger was actually the legal heir of a small factory. However, his foolish father, Sujad, had been treating him worse than an ordinary employee. It was as if he was a convict doing hard labor in a salt pan. In order to please his greedy new wife, Sujad announced that after his death, the freshwater production plant would be inherited by his newborn son. Fortunately, the process of changing ownership was rather troublesome. Until a few days ago, when Sujad fell seriously ill, the procedures had yet to be completed. For a long time, Iger was a lonely young man who didn't make any friends in the city. But in the last few months, he had met his only confidant, a fat red-skinned little angel with tattered bat-like wings. Only when Edgar came to the condensation workshop alone, this creature called Kuzu would appear. Then, Kuzu would whisper cunning advice into Edgar's ear in a hissing, ear-piercing voice. "This factory should have belonged to you, Edgar." Kuzu whispered. "That stepmother not only disrupted the order set by God, but it is also very likely that she poisoned your father. Otherwise, why would he fall ill so suddenly? In order to protect your property, you should take some measures." Edgar had rejected Kuzu's advice countless times, but today, before he got off work, he finally accepted the terrifying reasoning of his close friend. The moon was bright and the stars were sparse. The rows of gas lamps on the street outside lit up. Edgar strode towards his father's house. The young factory owner had made up his mind to commit a dark and terrible crime with the shovel in his hand. Of course, he thought that he was righteous. He pushed open the door, faced his father, greedy stepmother, and young baby, and slowly raised the shovel. Kikik, Zidabani-I Temalala Pa, in the air, a red little angel with a straightened back and stretched out his wings, spoke to himself in a language that mortals couldn't understand as he quickly flew past one block after another. Kuzu was going to report. The master he served, the guild leader named Dagolan, had already told him, "As long as something happens, you must let me know as soon as possible." However, no matter if it was Dagolan or Edgar, they didn't know that Tarimala was a purgatory language used to scold people. It meant something like brainless idiot. If you added pa behind it, it would represent the plural. These two guys are really not as good as those spellcasters. Kuzu sighed in his heart. He was a little devil, an ordinary person among the Batsu people in the 9 prisons of Bader. When he first came to the Ash World, Kuzu's identity was a magic pet. A black-robed mage from the aristocratic council of the Medici Empire summoned Kuzu, a little devil, from the 9 prisons of Bader, and used a series of deterrence methods to force Kuzu to sign a magic pet contract with him. Of course, the word forced was in quotation marks. Kuzu was happy to sign that kind of magic pet contract. He was already tired of the 9 prisons. Even though it was the hometown of the Batsu people, Batsu's level of friendliness was too low for a little devil. Not to mention the intermediate and senior devils who could kill him at will. Even some places with bad environments were dangerous places for a weak little devil like him. Moreover, the dangerous places were so vast that it was probably the entire 9 prisons of Bader. For example, the Batsa devil was naturally immune to fire damage, but the fire rain from Avernus was still very dangerous for Kuzu. Although the flames would not hurt him, there was no guarantee that there was a medium-sized meteorite in the flames. Smaller or lighter rocks could easily break his bones and break his tendons. Larger rocks the size of a human fist could easily crush a small demon to death. Therefore, to be able to come to the material plane, even if he was bound by a spellcaster as a magic pet, was much easier for the little devil than to live in the 9 prisons of Bader. In fact, in the eyes of many little devils, including Kuzu, to be able to live in the material plane was a blessing. Needless to say, the Ash World was a place detested by the gods. Without the gods here, a little devil like him was like a fish in water. In just a few decades, the black-robed mage from the aristocratic council had killed himself. Relying on the loophole he found in the magic pet contract, Kuzu directly got rid of the binding between him and the spellcaster, and was able to smell the precious breath of freedom. Although Kuzu still found a guild leader in Taka City to serve him out of his nature of relying on the strong, he asked himself honestly, recently, he was simply too happy. In particular, the way the guild leader acted was really to the taste of the devils. That guy is so evil. Kuzu laughed and thought silently in his heart. Especially in the past few months, Mr. Dugolan seems to have been possessed by the devil. Everything he says and does is like a proper Batsu. Interesting. If I bring such a soul into the 9 prisons of Bader, I might be able to directly skip the 2 stages of soul shell and inferior devil and become a Batsa devil on the spot. However, while Kuzu was calculating how many inferior soul prisms he could transfer if he made this deal, he immediately considered a terrible consequence that he had to take precautions against in advance. If that guy directly becomes a devil, it'll be fine if he's at the same stage as me. But if he becomes a grandmaster above the middle stage, won't I be in trouble? Regardless of whether he will find trouble with me or not, just the thought of him being able to achieve a higher level than me, Kuzu, can't take this line down. Difficult, a little devil luring soul from hell I have to choose. Because of jealousy, Kuzu, who was originally in high spirits, suddenly became like a frosted eggplant. He flapped his wings and flew in the air like a bee, flying in an 8 pattern. He wanted to meet Dugolan later. Perhaps Dugolan would miss the opportunity to smoothly take over Edgar's factory because of this, harming others without benefiting himself. But the little devil was happy. However, this guy's little trick failed in the end. The guild leader named Dugolan did not wait for him in the agreed room in the Grand Arena. Instead, he directly appeared on Kuzu's way to the rendezvous point. Too careless. Kuzu glanced at the man who walked out of the alley with a throwing knife in his hand and looked at him from the corner of his eyes. He felt that he had considered too little. However, he could not be blamed. After all, he was just a little devil. How much could he achieve? However, what he did not consider was not just a little. A smile appeared on Dugolan's face as he elegantly and charmingly showed off his sharp, shiny canine teeth. After seeing the little devil, he combed his short, shiny hair and made a gap in his forehead, revealing 2 small, lamb-like horns. His pupils changed color in an instant. His gaze was as red as blood. Coupled with his gorgeous and fashionable trench coat, he looked like an evil vampire. However, the vampire's feet did not look like split beast hooves, and there would not be a tail wrapped in dark red scales behind his butt. Reaper? Demon? Kuzu's eyes widened. The little devil suddenly felt that his brain had stopped working. He could not understand. A year ago, when they signed the Hell employment contract, Doug Olin was still a pure human. How did he become a middle-stage Batsa devil now? Chapter 1047. Dogolin. This name was a little strange if it was used on a human, because it was an authentic dwarf name. The prefix dol meant weapon or sword in the dwarf language, while the suffix grimgrin meant eternal or unforgettable. When the two were combined, Dogolin could mean eternal weapon or unforgettable sword. This meant that the person who named it hoped that the person who received this name would fight endlessly. Interesting, wasn't it? If you knew Dugolin's background, you would understand that there was a deep meaning behind his name. More than 40 years ago, when Dogolin was still an infant, he was imprisoned in the Grand Arena with his parents who were convicted of colluding with the demonic fish in the salt lake outside the city. There were no accidents. His noble parents, who had lived like princes for a long time, died in the Grand Arena in less than 3 days. It was also at that time that he was adopted by a dwarf. The dwarf was a free gladiator. Because he loved to fight, he kept fighting in the Grand Arena. As the adopter, the dwarf personally gave Dogolin a name. After all, although the dwarves had adopted him, according to the laws of the Medici Empire's Taka City, Dogolin had already been branded as a slave gladiator. If he wanted to walk out of the Grand Arena openly, the only way was to win 30 consecutive gladiator battles. In the Grand Arena, the dwarf gladiator stayed for about 16 years before he left alone. For the dwarves, who had an average lifespan of at least 200 years, these 16 years were only equivalent to 5 or 6 years of an ordinary human's life. It was not long, but it was not short either. At least, he taught Dogolin the right way to fight, as well as some unique skills of the dwarves. Of course, because of racial differences, Dogolin, as a human, could never fight like a real dwarf. It was just like how he could never be like the dwarf with his super good liver, who could drink a whole barrel of beer without getting drunk. So, until the dwarf left Taka City, Dugolin's record of consecutive victories was only 3. Moreover, even if it was only 3 consecutive victories, Dogolin almost lost his life. If there were no accidents, he would not be able to walk out of the Grand Arena as a free man. If he continued to fight, he would die. In the end, the dwarf freelance gladiator used all the income he had earned in the Grand Arena over the years to buy a 3-month recuperation period for Dogolin. During this period, he did not have to risk his life to participate in the gladiator competitions. He could take the opportunity to recuperate. However, even the dwarf felt that he had only delayed the end of Dugolin's life by 3 months. And this sense of powerlessness and loss might have been the real reason why the dwarf had left the Grand Arena, or even the Ashen World, disheartened. After the dwarf-free gladiators left, Dogolin, who had no one to protect him, was naturally bullied. Many gladiators even bet on how many gladiators he would be able to survive after 3 months of recuperation to bet on him. In the first month of the 3-month recuperation period, Dugolin's heart was dead. Every day, other than eating and drinking, he would lie on his bed and sleep. In the second month, Dogolin began to occasionally go to the side of the Grand Arena to watch other gladiators fight to the death. This was something he had never experienced before, because the dwarf would urge him to practice martial arts whenever he was free. At the beginning of the 3rd month, in the eyes of others, Dogolin did not know what was wrong with him. He actually sold a set of steel half-body plate armor that the dwarf had left for him at a low price to the Grand Arena, as well as a dwarf's broadaxe that was made of well-tempered steel. After receiving the silver cate that he got from selling the superior weapon, Dogolin bought an ordinary dagger that had no other advantages other than the common buff spell Cat's Grace. It was an ordinary dagger that did not have any other advantages. Even so, he sold the dagger at a low price to the Grand Arena, but the items he bought were extremely expensive. Therefore, in the end, Dagolin did not even have the money to buy himself a leather armor, a leather shield, or other protective equipment. However, no one knew if he was not fated to die, or if he was really enlightened and suddenly understood some problems. But Dagolin actually survived the first gladiator battle after the recuperation period, which many gladiators thought he would definitely die. His opponent that time was a gladiator with a sword and shield that was very popular in the Grand Arena at that time. His opponent was 7 or 8 years older than Dagolin, and he was in the prime of his health. He was also very experienced, and he was good at using a sword and a shield. He was good at both offense and defense, and he was very difficult to deal with. At that time, everyone thought that Dagolin would become his opponent's stepping stone, and he would be hacked to death by the gladiator with a sword and shield. However, after the gladiator battle started, he changed his fighting style. He did not pay attention to heavy attacks, and he fought steadily and steadily. He also focused on offense and defense. Instead, he was more like an assassin. His movements were unpredictable, and he jumped up and down, waiting for an opportunity to strike. He exhausted the gladiator with a sword and shield, and then killed him with a sneak attack. Since then, Dagolin had continuously encountered fishnet gladiators, pursuers, and double-blade gladiators. In the last gladiator battle before he walked out of the Grand Arena, he actually encountered an orc gladiator with a heavy cavalry, riding on a 6-legged horse, and 2 desert elf archers riding on gray-scaled birds with crossbows in their hands. However, in the end, he relied on a dagger to successfully counterattack. Of course, after that battle, Dagolin was almost beaten to death. He did not know how many of his ribs were broken, and he could not even sit up straight for a long time in the future. His right leg was also trampled by the 6-legged horse, and he became a cripple. However, no matter what, Dagolin had indeed completed a 30-match winning streak. He successfully walked out of the Grand Arena before he was 20 years old, and he became a free man again. Although his body could no longer continue to fight, he relied on the rewards from the audience that he accumulated as a gladiator, especially when he became a celebrity gladiator in the later stage. Without applying for a loan from the Chamber of Commerce, Dagolin built his own freshwater production factory. Through years of operation, he first earned back his capital, then made profits, and then invested to expand the scale of production. Currently, Dagolin had more than 50 community freshwater production factories. Although it was only 1/10 of the total number of freshwater production factories, in fact, almost 1/3 of the water used by Dagolin's industry was supplied by Dagolin's industry. When he was in his early 40s, Dagolin had an indisputable advantage and was elected as the guild leader of the freshwater industry. If he was not so serious, Dagolin's life experience might more or less be considered as a protagonist template. However, he had never thought of it that way. How many times had he reviewed the first half of his life? This successful guild leader and former champion gladiator of the Grand Colosseum kept thinking about it. Most of the hardships in the past had to do with the name that the dwarves had bestowed upon him, sort of indomitable resolve. He would not give up. As long as he did not die, he would continue to fight. The rewards that came from fighting were so sweet. Chapter 1048. Kuzu, what do you think I should do? Standing in the alley and staring at the brightly lit Sugard's house, Dagolin whispered to the little devil on his shoulder. Although the little devil had expressed many times that he did not dare to sit on the shoulder of a reaper, Dagolin still used the story of holding Huang Qingsong's hand to educate him. This was not overstepping his authority, and the little devil was no different from a hawk or a dog. He told him not to take himself too seriously. Master, Kuzu folded his wings. If it were not for the horns on his head, he would have looked like a large mouse. I calculated the time. The guard of Taka City passed by here every day at this time. Edgar killed his father, Sugard, his stepmother, and his little brother. It seems that the situation has been exposed. After all, he is not an experienced killer, so there is nothing suspicious about him making some noise. It seemed like he was stating a fact instead of answering, but this was the shrewdness of the little devil. The roar of the order from afar, The sound of leather boots on the ground, the clattering of hooves, and the clanking of metal seemed to confirm his words. Even Doggelin, who had become a reaper, had to admit that in terms of scheming, humans were far inferior to the Batsid Devil. Those demons were naturally experts in scheming. Their talents were high, and with the support of their diligence, how could their achievements be low? In fact, the reason why Doggelin became a reaper was similar to the unlucky child, Edgar. It was because he unknowingly fell into the trap of an unknown devil. He indeed became a reaper last month. At that time, Doggelin, who was already the president of the Freshwater Production Association, wanted to fulfill the prophecy of the sword of never giving up. He wanted to move up and become the real leader of this industry. At least, he had to let his industry occupy more than half of the Taka City market. In order to achieve this goal, in addition to letting the little devil, Kuzu, run around, he also took out the dagger that he used to survive in the Grand Arena. Just in case, Doggelin specifically found a black-robed mage and spent money to add a few more magic effects to the weapon. In order to save costs, the black-robed mage didn't use his own spell slot. He simply used a spell scroll that his teacher had obtained a long time ago to enchant the dagger. There were a total of 3 effects. The first was to strengthen the dagger's original cat's elegance, then add a sharpness spell and a slightly more expensive vampiric touch version of the dagger. However, who would have thought that it was the stinginess of that spellcaster that caused Goran to fall into his trap? The magic scroll with the secondary version of vampiric touch looked like ordinary parchment, but it was actually a piece of skin from a middle demon. It was not the black-robed mage's teacher who had traveled to the Ashes world. Instead, it was the unreasonable hand that had been casually thrown into the Ashes world by a senior demon hundreds of years ago. Perhaps the senior demon didn't have any big plans. He just thought that although the secondary version of vampiric touch was not a very valuable treasure, it would not be used by ordinary people. Using the hidden cards, the senior demon had a high probability of capturing a decent mortal soul. This was a long-term business. It would make a lot of money, but the probability of losing money was also low. However, because of the sudden change in the Ashes world a few months ago, although only a few people knew the truth, the senior demon's long-term business had encountered the law of surprise. When Doggelin picked up the dagger, the senior demon not only did not obtain the former's soul, but also, because the former was in accordance with a certain law of hell, it was forcibly deprived of some of its power and fed back to Doggelin. In this way, Doggelin directly fell into depravity and became a middle demon harvester. This was a kind of demon that was famous in Bar, though. A large number of harvester workers worked on the front line of the main material plane, rushing about for the depravity of mortals. For example, now, he could earn about 300 silver cats a year from the Sugard family's freshwater production plant, and his family's market share increased by an entire block. And the price was only a little more than a month's worth of saliva from the little demon Kuzu. This was a very good deal. However, Doggelin felt that it could be even better. In the eyes of a harvester, the garrison of Taka City was not a good-for-nothing, but it would not have a higher evaluation. After all, those guys were not tough nails like the city guards or the supervision team of the scale of Perpetual Order. The toughest weapons in their hands were just some flintlock guns. If it were not for the fact that the captain of the garrison had a complete military version of the fanatic armor, the squad leaders under his command were also equipped with a simplified version of the half-fanatic armor, and the headquarters had a mage group, led by a black-robed mage and 5 or 6 gray-robed mages as auxiliary mages. The Taka garrison might not be as elite as the guards of some of the local big families and guilds. For a routine night patrol like today, the garrison would not have any spellcasters with them. After all, as one of the first cities to join the scale of Perpetual Order, Taka City had been peaceful for a long time. Except for the chaos caused by the demonic fish 30 years ago, which was wiped out by the Chamber of Commerce. This important city in the south, which was originally part of Medica's territory, had always been peaceful. The current emir was actually the 3rd generation of the family leader who had formed an alliance with the Chamber of Commerce. Because of this, the emir family had been the governor of Taka City for more than 50 years. It was almost no different from swaggering. Dugolin used an illusion on himself and Kuzu, and then followed the patrolman who rushed into the mansion because they heard the call for help and walked into the mansion together. They saw Edgar, who was holding a blood-stained shovel in his hand, trying to escape in panic. The young man who had just committed a heinous crime was so scared that he almost peed his pants. 7 or 8 flintlock guns were aimed at him. No matter where he ran, he would be shot into a ragged doll-like corpse. How happy he felt when he committed the heinous crime of killing his loved ones was how terrible he felt now. There was no doubt that he would not be able to escape this time. Kuzu, where are you? Come and save me. Didn't you say you would help me? Edgar threw the shovel aside. When he was on the ground and was tied up with ropes by the garrison patrols, he suddenly screamed at the top of his lungs. He had an agreement with his little angel friend. The other party said that he would be a lookout for him and that there would be no mistakes in tonight's incident. Shut up, you vicious murderer. A garrison soldier whipped Edgar's face with the butt of his gun. Half of his face was red and swollen, and a few of his teeth were broken. Edgar was hit so hard that he could not say anything. Even his high spirit, which was produced by the secretion of a large amount of adrenaline, disappeared in an instant and turned into a pile of mud. Chapter 1049. It's really useless. Dugolin, who was invisible, saw this scene and frowned. He then scratched his temples with the dagger, as if he was scratching an itch. I've already committed enough evil deeds to become a Batsu. But in the end, even if I become a devil, I can only become an inferior demon. Really, let's do it this way. It was his first time doing this kind of thing, so he couldn't ask for too much. The newly promoted demonic reaper Dugolin advised himself not to be stubborn. Thinking of this, he no longer hesitated and used the dagger to cut off a small piece of skin from his tail. Even if he was a devil, such a palm-sized wound would heal itself in a short while. However, Dugolin did not even frown when he cut himself. He was definitely a ruthless person. Anyway, as a bystander, Kuzu felt that she could not be so ruthless to herself. Oomph! Perhaps he sensed the thoughts of the little devil on his shoulder. Dugolin could not help but snort coldly. However, he did not stop the movement of his hands. Because the dagger had a secondary version of vampire's touch, the skin that was cut off was quickly dehydrated and turned into a parchment-like material. Dugolin used his hand to touch it, and in an instant, hundreds of infernal runes appeared on the parchment. This was not an infernal contract like a contract demon. The Reaper's rank was still not high enough, and he needed to advance at least once before he could become a contract demon. Instead, it was a hell bond that the Reaper used his innate ability to conjure up. Its function was relatively simple, and it could only be used to lend power to mortals and devils. Of course, the power that he could lend to mortals was not much, and the time he could lend it was not long. However, after accepting the power of the devil, most mortals would not be able to withstand the tempering of evil and would fall. They would be marked with a devil's mark, and after death, they would fall into the 9 prisons of Bader and become the raw material for the soul shell. The soul shell was not a formless smoke, nor was it a hard shell in the literal sense. On the contrary, they were creatures of flesh and blood. They were close to what they looked like when they were alive, but they were covered in filth. However, they were covered in filth and seemed to be slightly more resilient. The diseases and injuries they suffered at the last moment of their lives still remained on their bodies. Those who did not fall to the ground before they died could still move freely, but those who were severely injured could only stay where they were. When a ship full of soul shells was transported to a place of torture, the black-hearted devil bureaucrats called Anzu would read the symbol of each soul and record the name of the devil responsible for harvesting it in a thick ledger. Next, these soul shells will be transported to terrifying rooms with all sorts of torture methods. The land of torment was usually managed and supervised by the lustful demons. They would regularly send reports to the lords at the peak of the soul harvest. When determining whether a devil active in the prime material plane could be promoted, these reports would be the most crucial basis. For most of the harvesters who used the dead of hell to corrupt people, At this point, he could get back his principal and interest. This was all they harvested. Then, when the relevant paperwork was compiled, copied, and filed, the soul shell would be subjected to a series of terrifying tortures. Just imagining the abominable details could make even the most determined mortal break out in cold sweat and panic all day long. According to the terms of the contract of primordial, as every bit of the petitioner's remaining personality was slowly stripped away, magic energy would be released and flow to the lord of the level. The interrogation team, made up of chain devils covered in chains and pain devils wearing masks, threatened and injured the fallen souls mercilessly until every bit of magic that could be extracted from their bodies was extracted. When the last vestiges of humanity were violently torn away from the body of a soul shell, the trembling empty shell would be thrown into a deep pit, such as the terrible maggot's cave in Avernus. There, they would quickly die, decay, and be reborn as inferior demons, the lowest existence of all devils. In this assembly line devil production process, the ones who earned the most benefits were usually the few devil lords in the various planes of Bader. Next were the secondary devil lords, or archdevils who owned the various lands of torment. Then, according to the strict hierarchy, the remaining benefits would be distributed to the screws of each process. Of course, this distribution method was not without exceptions. For example, if a harvester found a very suitable fallen soul, it did not need to go through the process of polishing the soul shell and could directly transform into a devil. Then, according to the contract of primordial, all the magic energy obtained by extracting the soul could be obtained by the harvester to benefit itself. Doug Olin wanted to try such a deal now. Whether he succeeded or not, it was another matter. Whether he did it or not, he would definitely choose to do it. Go! He threw the completed dead of hell to Kuzu and said to the little devil, "Give it this bond. Once the deal is done, you and I will split the profits." Kuzu's eyes lit up. The little devil vaguely felt that this trip was worth it. Flying a few dozen yards away, it could obtain half of the power of a fallen soul. This was a great deal, and he felt that he had made a fortune this time. Just wait and see. Kuzu laughed. He held the dead of hell that was made from the skin of a harvester and flew to Kinslayer Edgar, who was lying on the ground like a dead dog in the courtyard. "Don't panic. I'm here to give you a treasure. Got it?" However, just as the imp tried to communicate with Edgar using telepathy, he was suddenly struck by 7 to 8 flintlock pistols before he could even complete his sentence. Kuzu, who had flown to Edgar's side and hovered over the youth's head, did not notice that her invisibility spell had been silently withdrawn by the harvester. In no time at all, the frail low-tier demon was torn apart by the bullets from the pistols. Blood spurted out, and his flesh was badly mutilated. With a soft thud, the little devil fell directly in front of Edgar and died with his eyes wide open. What was strange was that his body did not dissolve into a pool of foam and move stealthily like the demons who died in the material plane. Instead, it lay flat on the ground, lifeless. The hell's debt that he held in his hand fell to the ground with Kuzu, and coincidentally, it landed on Edgar's head. Like a drop of ink in a cup, the small piece of paper disappeared without a trace. "I'm going to kill you all." Edgar's eyes were bloodshot, and he suddenly struggled to get up from the ground. Because his hands were tied behind his back, he could not put his fist in front of his face. However, Edgar was bewitched by an unknown rage. After committing a great crime, he buried his head and charged at the garrison soldier beside him. He used his head to knock the soldier's butt over, and the soldier fell hard on the ground. Asterisk bang, bang, bang. Asterisk a few more gunshots were heard, and the flintlock bullets hit Edgar's body, taking away the young man who had basically lost his mind. His body fell on the little devil Kuzu, and the latter's sharp horn pierced through Edgar's body stomach. Their blood mixed together and seemed to have some kind of reaction, turning into a highly corrosive acidic solution. This blood, which was very similar to the acidic solution, corroded Edgar and Kuzu's bodies into a pile of mud at a very unreasonable speed. The rope that tied Edgar's 2 arms behind his back also lost its function because his arms had been completely corroded. Asterisk gurgle. Gurgle, gurgle. Asterisk, a lump of something that looked like a slime monster suddenly emerged from the pile of mud. It had vague facial features, which made the monster look even more terrifying, but it could not see, hear, or smell any information around it. It was a newly born inferior demon, without any intelligence to speak of. It trembled and writhed, forever enduring the severe physical pain. After becoming an inferior demon, it no longer retained the slightest memory of its mortal life. Although these pitiful and tragic creatures could not even have the slightest bit of conscious thought, somehow they could vaguely realize that the opportunity for advancement was waiting for them. The only thing they needed to do was to find a way to show their innate evil nature. As mentioned before, the inferior demons could not see, hear, or smell any information around them. But even so, they still had a way to perceive some things around them. For example, Edgar, who had transformed into a lesser demon, could still sense the presence of several Taka City Garrison Force soldiers beside him. The reason was very simple. Even if the mortals had a belly full of evil in their hearts, they could not be filled with evil thoughts like a real demon. In the inferior demon's pitiful senses, as long as the mortals had a little bit of kindness, it was as obvious as a bonfire lit in the dark night. Therefore, the newly born inferior demon instinctively pounced on the soldiers. Even though it didn't know how to kill, it relied on its body, which was similar to the ooze, to ignore the damage of ordinary flames and bullets. It could pour its mud-like body into the mouth, nostrils, and ears of the enemy, gouging out the enemy's eyeballs. It shared the pain it suffered with the mortals. Seeing this scene, Gorlin, the demonic reaper, could not help but laugh. Then, he removed the concealment spell on his body. Just now, he had absorbed all the power that could be extracted from a complete fallen soul. For a harvester who was only an intermediate devil, it was as carefree as drinking a large cup of nectar. He decided to move around a bit. Tossing the enchanted dagger in his hand up and down, this guy walked with the footsteps of a rogue trained in the grand arena. He slowly walked behind the garrison soldiers who were entangled with the lesser demons. The mantis stalks the cicada, unaware of the oriole behind. The corner of Dugalin's mouth curled up. He remembered that he had participated in several free-for-all gladiatorial performances. At that time, he was also like this, playing the role of the final reaper. The first one, the reaper handed over the dagger while counting silently in his heart. Pust! The sharp blade pierced into flesh, and a soft sound rang out. However, this sound did not come from one of the soldiers who had been ambushed. Instead, it came from Dugolin, who involuntarily clutched his neck. A line of blood had appeared on his neck. Moreover, there was a wound, but not a drop of blood flowed out from the wound. This was because the weapon that cut the wound was enhanced with the advanced version of Vampire's Touch. The 35th one. After confirming that the Reaper was completely dead, Jarlaxle, the leader of the Diet Dark Elf mercenary group, recorded a number in a small book. This was his account book. He could use the records in it to collect the bounty from the scale of perpetual order. The few garrison soldiers of Taka City who spent a lot of effort and finally killed the inferior demon with an alchemy bomb saw the corpse of the evil demon on the ground. At the same time, they saw the secret agent token of the Chamber of Commerce in Jarlaxle's hand. They all chose to keep their mouths shut and did not dare to ask more. Chapter 1050. To the west of the Desert Elves' sacred mountain, about 500 pale sands away, there was another famous mountain in the Ash world. It had a famous name, Thundercliff. At the same time, this place was the traditional core of the Blue Dragon Clan's territory. It was the birthplace of the Dragon Clan's kobolds, their ancestral home. As the scale of perpetual order spread across the world, the Dragon Clan's kobolds slowly developed and became more civilized. Only near the ancient residence of Thundercliff, some Dragon Clan kobolds still maintained their original tribal social structure. For example, Thundertooth Town. The Dragon Clan was one of the first 3 major tribes of kobolds, the Sharptooth tribe, which had taken root here. Relying on a branch of the Thundercliff, They built a town in the vast sea of sand. Unlike many kobolds from other material planes, perhaps because the natural conditions of the ash world were too harsh, the desert kobolds were much stronger and tougher than other kobolds. When they stood up, they were about 1/3 taller than other kobolds, between 3 feet and 3 feet 6 inches tall. Their average weight was more than 40 pounds, and some could even reach 60 pounds. They had scaly skin between reddish-brown and black, and their eyes ranged from birch to red. Their legs were muscular and walked on toes. They had long clawed fingers, crocodile-like jaws, and small white or brown horns protruding from their heads. They also had a long tail like a mouse. They did not have a stench of wet dogs or dead puddles that other kobolds often had. Instead, they smelled like dry sand. Kobolds were very prolific, oviparous creatures, and they had the highest birth rate among humanoid creatures. However, unlike other species, although the desert kobold's reproduction rate was higher than that of other humanoid creatures, it was not as exaggerated as that of ordinary kobolds. A pregnant female desert kobold would lay her eggs within 2 weeks. Only about 1 in 10 pregnant women would lay 2 eggs. An egg needed about 2 months to incubate, and a newly hatched kobold could walk within a few hours. Compared to ordinary kobolds, the eggs of desert kobolds were especially sturdy. Even if these eggs were to break 15 days earlier, most of the hatchlings would survive. The desert kobold hatchlings matured very quickly, and they would reach adolescence in 7 or 8 years. They often laid eggs in a common nest, and special adoptive parents would take care of these eggs and hatchlings. All the Dragon Clan kobold hatchlings also had to receive 3 years of compulsory training prescribed by the Great Master of Megalosaurus, Keys. In these 3 years, the hatchlings had to learn language, mathematics, and some other basic knowledge, as well as corresponding combat skills. When they reached adulthood, if they wanted to enter the Chamber of Commerce to engage in more professional work, they had to undergo induction training of varying lengths. This is definitely the best era. In the Kobold clan, many elders who had lived long enough would use this sentence to educate the younger generation of the clan. They had a deep understanding of the benefits of receiving education. Not to mention the implementation of this compulsory education system for nearly 50 years. There were many spellcasters with the blood of warlocks among the Dragon Clan kobolds near Thundercliff. Just look at those Dragon Clan employees who held various positions in various departments of the Chamber of Commerce. Compared to their ancestors who could only hold worn-out swords and spears in front of the battlefield in the past, weren't they extremely lucky? Although education might not be able to change everyone's life, receiving education was a way out for everyone. In Thundertooth Town, the most famous bard, Jin, completely agreed with this point of view. If it were not for the compulsory education system set by the Great Master of Megalosaurus, desert kobolds like him, who were born with some congenital deficiencies, would have died within a few years, even if they had lived to adulthood. They would not have had the opportunity to go out and travel to the Ashes world and the Ramsey world, and then return home to become a star. He bought a medium-sized shop on Dragon's Tooth Road, the busiest street in Thundertooth Town. Every day, he would go on stage to tell stories, sing, and perform. He compiled his experiences in a foreign land and told the townsfolk in the form of bards. He also earned his daily income through the latter's tips. Because he was knowledgeable and his rapping was very interesting, his shop was full every day with customers coming in and out. Even some of the surrounding towns, and even the nearby city of Nome, would have regular customers come to listen to his stories. What's more, there were several shops around his shop that specialized in fast food and snacks. They were all making a lot of money because of Jin. Not only could they make money by selling food, but they could also earn 2 or 3 silver cats by renting tables and chairs to customers who did not have a place to stay in Jin's shop. However, just like the saying, the moon waxes and wanes, after Jin returned to his hometown to run the bard shop and earned a lot of fame and a lot of silver cats, he was now a little worried. He was almost done telling the stories in his stomach. No matter how many plots and twists he arranged, if he continued to tell stories for 3 or 4 years, he would eventually run out of stories to sing. Finally, on this day, Jin decided to hang a closed sign in front of the shop. He carried his backpack and hiking stick and went out for a stroll for a while. It was not only for the sake of collecting wind, but also to give himself a break and change his mood. As for whether he was going to travel to other countries on the Leviathan airship, he had not decided yet. Perhaps he had to go to the island world that he had never been to before, as well as the sigil city that was said to be occupied by the scales of Eternity Chamber of Commerce. Or perhaps he just needed to stay near Thundercliff and see the scenery that he hadn't seen since he returned to his hometown. Then he would have new inspiration, create new works, and continue to open his shop when he returned. Walking on the path outside Thundertooth Town, Dijin hummed a poem that he had just made up. His mood was like floating clouds. Kobold pick up hose, wow. Catch a rat, eat it. Dig for treasure, someone will buy it. Dwarfs like shiny things, we like wax. The best thing that flows out of a whale's brain. Take a small amount of money, buy wax to play with. Bandits with knives, rush to rob money. Smashing while scaring, how scary. Note, do not think about the name Dijin. Dijin the Bards was the most famous kobold character in D&D. He adventured in the north in the year 1370 of the Valley Calendar until he became a shop owner a few years later. He appeared in Under the Vulture Point, The Dragon Queen's Treasure Mountain, The Return of Randall Moan, The Rise of Tiamat, The Secret of the Haunted Spider, Sword of the Valley, Tomb of Oblivion, and The Tomb of Damara. He was also involved in the video games Baldur's Gate 3 and Neverwinter Nights, OL. Chapter 10:51. Dijin carefully observed these 7-foot-tall humanoid creatures. Their skin was slightly gray, their noses were black, and their faces were like dogs. They were ugly, but what really bothered the kobold of the Dragon Clan was the spears and bows in their hands that were blocking the way. The bard recognized these creatures. He had seen them in books when he was young, and he had also seen gnolls who were confiscated of their property and forced to work in the labor camps in Japan. In the general handbook that every kobold youth of the Dragon Clan had to read, they were described as follows. Gnolls are huge, evil, humanoid creatures that are like coyotes. Although they always move in groups, they are very loosely organized. They walk upright on 2 feet, and their hands are like normal humans, and they can use tools. Gnolls have dark green skin, and the color near the snout is darker. Their yellow hair has a little grayish red. Gnolls have their own language, but some also speak the language of orcs or goblins. When a group of gnolls dressed as bandits appeared in front of him, Dijin considered whether he should turn around and run. However, if he dared to turn his head, either the spear would pierce his body, or he would be hit by an arrow. Dijin could only stand still. Among the gnolls, there was a tall guy with bright red hair. He had been staring at Dijin for a long time. "What are you thinking about?" Little Dijin asked in a calm tone. Although he recognized the gnolls, this was the first time he had dealt with them. According to the general handbook, gnolls were similar to goblins. They were evil, capricious, and very dangerous. The gnolls did not move, nor did they make a sound. Dijin knew that those guys were weighing the pros and cons. If they killed a sharp-toothed kobold near the Dragon Clan's sharp-toothed tribe, they would most likely be severely punished. However, the small rattan suitcase on his back was very attractive. If they wanted to live, they had to take advantage of the gnolls' hesitation. Dijin was a bard. Although it was a relatively uncommon jack-of-all-trades type of profession, it did not mean that he did not have considerable combat power. In fact, a bard could cast spells like a warlock. In particular, little Dijin was a celebrity bard. The more charismatic he was, the easier it would be for him to cast some bard spells. He waved his hand, and a harmless purple flame appeared around the gnolls. Atmosphere flame, a trick used by bards to set up the atmosphere. It could summon a cluster of colorful flames on the target. Although it couldn't cause any fire damage to the target, the weird demonic fire could mark the target and see through some camouflage. Now, Dijin had also developed another use for the atmosphere flame, to scare those uneducated gnolls. And, just as he wished, a jackhound immediately fell to the ground in fear. However, the rest of the Jackalans quieted down under the gesture of their experienced leader. They still looked around anxiously, not knowing what to do. The Knoll leader looked back at his companions, as if he was estimating the power of the flames. Then, he lowered the spear in his hand, not allowing the tip of the spear to point at the dog-headed man from the dragon family clan. At the same time, he motioned for his companions to do the same. Dijin could not help but breathe a sigh of relief. Then, the Knoll leader spoke for a while in a language that the bard could not understand. After seeing little Dijin's puzzled expression, he simply repeated it in the goblin language and the dog-headed man language. Dijin could understand the goblin language, so naturally, the dog-headed man language was not a problem. However, because the Knoll leader's accent was very strange, he could only recognize a few words intermittently, such as friend, leader, and so on. "I'll go with you." Dijin tried to imitate the goblin language with a strange accent. The Knoll leader roared a few times. This time, the bard could only understand the meaning of the last word. "Ally? Ally!" the Knoll leader shouted. The other jack-o'-lanterns smiled in relief and patted each other's backs in relief. Next, the dog-headed bard and the group of gnolls walked along the winding path and walked to a small forest beside the road. The gnolls kept a distance from him and did not walk together. Dijin did not know if this action was out of respect for his identity as a spellcaster or for other reasons. But he guessed that maybe those guys knew that they had a strong stench on them that could not be washed away even after bathing. The Knoll leader occasionally came over to chat, and from time to time, he would playfully wink and rub his thick, meaty palms to express his excitement. Dijin could not understand what the Knoll leader was saying, but the Knoll leader kept smacking his lips, so the bard guessed that they were going to attend a banquet. It did not take long for them to reach the destination of their trip. In a small oasis surrounded by windbreak trees, there was a camp surrounded by several caravans. From the flags on the caravans, it should be a caravan from a noble family in a small place in the destroyed Medici Empire. The flag was painted with the style of the Medici Empire. The scale of perpetual order had now completely taken over the Medici Empire, and the great Megalosaurus Keys had also become the de facto master of this country. However, the Chamber of Commerce did not eliminate the original forces of the empire. As long as they followed the rules, the Chamber of Commerce and the benevolent Megalosaurus would still allow them to survive on this land. Many small nobles who originally lived in various parts of the Medici Empire had now devoted themselves to business in order to maintain their family's expenses. In this regard, the scale of perpetual order's attitude was to neither deliberately support nor suppress them. As long as they followed the rules of business and did not sell contraband, the profits and losses would be their own. However, because these nobles' caravans did not belong to the scale of perpetual order, they became a delicacy in the eyes of many bandits. Under the cover of the thorny bushes, the gnolls stopped about 500 yards away from the camp. Dijin could see that these guys did not have good intentions towards the caravan that was camping. They had already gathered into a battle formation. In order to conserve drinking water and energy, the desert's caravans usually stayed in the day and moved at night. They would only start moving in the evening. At this time, it was 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon. The hottest time of the day had just passed. The caravan would set off in 3 or 4 hourglasses. The 2 or 3 guards on duty also relaxed their vigilance and prepared to stare at each other for a while to recover their energy. A caravan, the Gnoll leader whispered above Dijin's head. This time, he deliberately spoke slowly to make sure that the kobold bard could fully understand him. 5 men, plus 2 women, a young woman, another young Gnoll eagerly added. The Gnoll leader glared at his fellow Gnoll and concluded with a low growl, and 5 young men. Enemies, the leader said. The Gnoll leader began to chatter again. Dijin could only understand intermittently, humans weak slaves. The rest of the Gnolls were worried that the kobold bard would change his attitude. They fiddled with their weapons uneasily and looked at each other. 5 men, Dijin asked. He was not sure why this guy did not mention the goods. Did he just want to kill them to vent his anger? The Gnoll leader slammed the ground with his spear. Kill the old men. Take the young ones. Women? Dijin asked again. A few Gnolls showed an evil smile instead of answering. Chapter 1052. The clatter of castanets, the rumble of brass drums. By the way, the ranger rushed forward at lightning speed. Before the spear moved, he had already closed in with his sword. The other four gnolls could only watch in shock as the two swords flashed quickly twice and tore the throat of their leader. The tall gnoll covered the wound with both hands and fell silently. The gnoll on the side was the first to recover from the shock. He raised his spear and rushed toward the ranger. The ranger deliberately waited until the last moment to dodge. Just as the gnoll couldn't stop in time and clumsily rushed past him, the ranger tripped over his opponent's ankle. The gnoll lost his balance and fell forward uncontrollably. The spear in his hand stabbed deeply into the chest of his stunned companion. The gnoll who accidentally killed his ally wanted to pull out his weapon, but the barbs at the tip of the spear hooked onto his spine and were firmly embedded in his poor companion's body. However, the heartless gnoll didn't care at all. He just wanted to get his weapon back. He showed disdain for his companion's painful expression and kept pulling and twisting the handle of the spear until the ranger crushed his skull with his sharp swords. The last gnoll thought that close combat was disadvantageous and planned to attack with a bow and arrow when the ranger wasn't paying attention. However, before he could fully draw his bow and arrow, a ferocious weasel jumped out and bit his ankle. This was naturally the ranger's backup plan. Thinking of defeat before the battle, it's still possible to kill the enemy. In the end, the ranger was an experienced and knowledgeable ranger. He had already put this group of gnolls into his net. If you want to know what happened next, listen to the next chapter. He received a round of applause, a full 10 copper debentures, and a large biscuit with fragrant barbecue. The bard, who had just finished telling a story, stood up and bowed to his audience to show his respect to those who provided for him. That ranger must be a druid, right? Otherwise, why would he have an animal companion? The adults left one after another and began to pack their bags, preparing to take advantage of the cool night to travel. A little girl, only 7 or 8 years old, stayed with the bard out of curiosity and asked him about the part of the story that she had just heard that puzzled her. Maybe, but he didn't tell me. Little Dijin shrugged his shoulders and put the small copper drum with a ferocious skunk engraved on its bottom into a compartment in the rattan trunk. Then he winked at the little listener and pretended to inadvertently reveal 2 hilts that were inserted into the side of the rattan box. They looked very similar to the handles. The little girl's eyes lit up and she giggled. A ranger's story, she imitated Dijin's tone and shouted. Then the little girl skipped away. Little Dijin snapped his fingers with a smug look on his face. The satisfaction of sharing a secret with someone was very strange. After eating the biscuits and meat that were both dinner and breakfast, Dijin used his rattan box as a desk and compiled the story that he just told to the audience in the last light of the eternal blaze. Because the theme was very new, he was still slightly lacking in terms of phrasing. The team of merchants, on the other hand, had already set off on their new journey. That was Shaq, a thin and weak goblin. His name in the goblin language meant crucible without a handle. He was dragging his heavy feet and slowly walking up a slightly steep stone slope. He had to go back and report the results of the search. The bodies of the 5 gnolls were all buried in a thorny forest. The unfortunate goblin believed that Wugulu would not like to hear this news. But what choice did he have? Escape to the desert wilderness on the other side of the mountain? No. The great Wugulu would find him at all costs and tear the traitor's body apart with his great strength. So, in the end, Sark pushed aside the bush with his trembling hands and entered the cave where Wugulu lived. "You're finally back," a goblin near the entrance said to him. "You've been gone for 2 days. I thought you were dead outside." Another goblin asked, "Did you find the gnolls?" Sark nodded and sucked in a breath of cold air. His face turned pale in an instant. He took deep breaths, but still could not relieve his nervousness. "Is Wugulu inside?" he asked in a low voice. The 2 goblins looked at each other curiously. "He found the gnolls," one of them guessed. "But it's a pile of corpses." "Wugulu will be furious," the other goblin said. At the same time, he lifted the thick curtain that led to the audience room with ill intentions. Sark looked behind him hesitantly and began to wonder if he should have come back. Perhaps running away was the right thing to do. But the goblin guard rudely pushed him into the audience room and blocked the entrance with a spear. The relationship between goblins, even if they were brothers, was terrible. Not long after birth, goblin cubs had to be completely self-reliant. In the tribe, these babies were treated like pets. Most tribes raised their children in cages or fences. This way, the adult goblins did not have to worry about their cubs running away. The mortality rate of goblin cubs was very high. Once the adult goblins could not raise them, or there was a shortage of food, these unfortunate cubs would understand early on that the tribe still had a last rations to survive. How good would the relationship between goblins who grew up in such an environment be? Sark, who dragged his feet and tried his best to move forward, finally attracted the attention of the owner of the cave, Wugulu. Wugulu looked like a mountain giant. Hill giants were a type of giant, but they were probably the weakest type of giant. They were selfish and cunning creatures. They would hunt near their territory and make a living by robbing and dominating the nearby humanoid creatures. Although mountain giants had low intelligence, they were still very strong warriors. They had a barbaric appearance and looked a bit like apes. They had long arms, hunchbacks, and wide foreheads. Even though mountain giants were the smallest among the giant race, their subcutaneous fat was famous for being thick. Their average height was 16 feet, and their weight was 4,500 pounds. Females and males had the same physique. Their skin was light brown, and some had a ruddy dark brown. Their hair was mostly brown or black, and their eyes were also black. Their lifespan was usually around 200 years. "Ah, Sark, your report." Wugulu waved his hand and motioned for the goblin scout to come closer so that it would be easier for him to report. I. The poor goblin stuttered and could not speak. Wugulu's eyes instantly turned orange. Everyone who worked under this terrifying tyrant knew that this was a dangerous signal. "I found a knoll," Sark blurted out. Even if he died, he would die a little later. "Dead. Killed. Dead." Wugulu asked calmly. Sark nodded. "Dead." Accompanied by an earth-shattering roar, the huge mountain giant rushed in front of the goblin scout like a whirlwind. His eyes burned with orange flames of anger. Wugulu roared angrily again. As the number of goblins gradually decreased, some were killed by the caravan guards or other monsters, and some became tools for Wugulu to vent his anger. This group of gnolls had become his main plundering force. "Get up, useless goblin. Tell me how this happened, and who did it." After venting his anger by roaring, Wugulu temporarily calmed down and then asked the scout who was lying on the ground and trembling. Sark tried to get up. After a minute, he finally managed to support his body with his knees. "I don't know," the goblin sobbed. "The gnolls are dead. There are knife wounds and bite marks on their bodies. However, I think they were killed by something not so big because the bite marks were on their ankles and the knife wounds were from the bottom up." Sark slowly moved his feet, trying to leave the interview room without attracting attention. But Wugulu stopped the goblin with his gaze. "Your report is good," the owner of the cave said. Sark sighed in relief. However, in the next second, Wugulu quickly stretched out his huge palm and grabbed the goblin's neck and lifted him up. "If you're willing to spend some time to investigate what happened to the gnolls, that would be even better." Sark almost lost consciousness. However, when half of the goblin's body was stuffed in Wugulu's mouth, Sark began to regret not fainting. Crunch, crunch, the mountain giant chewed in big mouthfuls and finally spat out a goblin skull with wide eyes. After all, no matter how much a goblin ate, it could not provide him with more power. There was no need to waste his teeth. He was not a real mountain giant. Other than venting his anger, the main reason he chewed and swallowed the flesh was to accumulate power. "Learn to control your anger," Wugulu warned himself. "Before returning to Bader, you must learn this survival skill." Wugulu's head that looked like a mountain giant twisted, opened his mouth, and used his tongue to lick the flesh and broken bones between his teeth. He restrained himself and did not change back to his original form, because if he did, he would have to kill everyone who saw or could see his true appearance. If he really did that, the team that he had painstakingly gathered would be wasted. At least before the next full moon, I have to devour a valuable life. Otherwise, even if I become an adult, after returning to the 9 prisons of Bader, my life will be in danger. Ugulu pondered as he waved his hand at a few goblin servants who were peering into the audience hall. Bring some fine sand and brooms over. Clean this place up. We will be having a barbecue feast later. The goblins were already familiar with this guy's temperament, so the latter did not mind. Their minds were full of the barbecue feast that Wugula mentioned, and whether they, as loyal servants, would have a chance to get a share of the pie. Chapter 10:53. The goblins guarding the door parted to both sides in a panic, because the great Ugulu was striding through the curtain to the entrance of the cave. In the early morning, the fresh and cold mountain breeze blew on the demon hound, making him feel very comfortable. It's a good day to work, he thought. The barbecue feast last night could be considered a success. At the very least, Uguru had solved some of the problems in his own army. For example, there were no longer any old or sick goblins holding them back. The remaining goblins could sacrifice their lives for him without reservation. Another example was that all the goblin warriors who were qualified to sacrifice their lives for him had eaten their fill before going to the battlefield. Their stomachs had become round, and they could walk with more strength. Burying the gnolls means that the guy doesn't want to attract attention. Maybe he is a celebrity in this area. Saving a group of caravans out of kindness means that the guy may be a good person, but I don't know how long this good person will last. Wugulu thought to himself. As a creature from the 9 hells of Bartholomew, his intelligence was not low. At least, his intelligence was several levels higher than that of the hill giant he used to disguise himself. Therefore, it only took him a few minutes to figure out all the problems. Yesterday, he was angry because of the report from that guy, so he didn't want to ask about it and decided to hold a banquet to relax. At most, I'll go there myself. Ugulu thought. Although the ash world was indeed deep, he was still quite confident in his own strength. At the very least, the area around the Thunderpool town with a radius of 100 parsands was like a small puddle in his eyes. Ugulu groaned as a last protest against the desire in his body, and then slowly walked down the mountain with great strides. He stopped at the entrance of the canyon. Although there were several winding paths along the cliff to the bottom of the valley, it would take a long time to finish. The problem was that Ugulu was hungry. This was not physical hunger, but a little anxiety in his heart. This time, the primitive desire prevailed. He began to concentrate on sensing the fluctuations of the surrounding magic energy. Wugulu was not a creature from a material plane. After entering a material plane, otherworldly creatures would usually not lose the various abilities they possessed in their original domain. In the eyes of humans, these abilities were not much different from magic, so they were called spell-like abilities. After a period of time, Wugula broke out of his meditative state. His eyes turned orange due to excitement as he looked at a canyon corridor below the cliff. It was about 4 to 5 miles away from him. After leaving Thundertooth Town, most of the caravans that ventured into the desert would choose to pass through this canyon corridor to reach Gnome City. A multicolored magic gate appeared in front of Wugulu out of thin air. He let out a thunderous laugh and pushed the magic gate open. On the other side of the door was the small piece of flat land that Wugulu had been staring at. He only needed to take one step forward to cross the distance barrier of the material world. He couldn't wait to carry out his plan. He couldn't help but quicken his pace and walk through the open door. When he stood on the path at the bottom of the canyon, he once again focused his mind to sense the magical energy. His muscles began to spasm continuously, and his bones creaked as they flowed through his body. Wugulu's body began to disintegrate and reassemble, constantly compressing. His skin gradually turned light brown. When he moved his legs again, this fellow was no longer a mountain giant with a huge body, but a desert elf with light steps, changing into anything, looking like anything. This was the talent of the Wugulu race. However, this talent could only allow them to perfectly disguise themselves as two races. Even the extremely talented Wugulu could only disguise himself as three different appearances in the material plane. After all, he was a demon from the lower realm, not a shape-shifting monster. In order to have such a perfect disguise, they had to use a secret technique as support. Within a certain period of time, they had to completely devour a creature of the race that they wanted to disguise themselves as. For example, his current transformation was obtained by devouring a desert elf at midnight on the night of the last full moon. Because he had been using the appearance of a mountain giant as a disguise, after turning into a desert elf, he had to adapt slightly before he began his work. Sharpening a knife would not delay the work of cutting wood. He bent down and squatted down, carefully examining the tracks of the vehicles and the residue of the livestock on the ground of the canyon corridor. Different from the trade routes in the desert, the wind in this canyon corridor was smaller, and the traces of the trade caravans could be preserved for a while. Apart from the hunting skills that the desert elves had summed up based on their experience of nomadism for generations, Wugulin naturally did not forget to use his own spell-like abilities. At first, he found a few tracks that were probably left by the vehicles that passed through the canyon last night. Then, he snapped his fingers and performed a prophecy spell named Tracking, determining which track was the target that he really wanted to chase. Now that he knew the answer, he immediately aimed at the intermittent mark and started running in the canyon corridor with large strides. The eternal blaze had risen. Even though the trade caravans, who coveted the relatively cool temperature in the canyon corridor, did not strictly follow the way of desert merchants, such as nocturnal, they would still slow down out of habit. That gave Wugulu a good opportunity, because the desert elves were a race of stamina in the first place, and his real identity was a demon from the lower realm who could barely be tired. He would definitely catch up with the target that he was chasing. That was exactly what happened. Although Wugulu's heart was full of hunger, he still ran for 4 or 5 hourglasses. By the time the eternal blaze was hanging high in the sky, he saw the target that the tracks led to. There was no surprise at all. Neither the unexpected loss of Wugulu nor the unexpected luck of the business caravan made of small noble families showed up. He sneaked into the trade caravan, first knocked out the men who were guards, and then gathered all the children and women to be interrogated together with the men. After accidentally lashing the face of the crying little girl a few times, everyone in the trade caravan began to tell Wugulu everything that he wanted to know, including the hidden account books and goods. You dare to secretly sell moon candy. After looking at the hidden box of smuggled goods, Wugulu first picked up a moon candy that looked like a soft candy with interest, threw it into his mouth, chewed, and tasted it. It's indeed something that has been purified. If normal people eat it, they will inevitably have gorgeous hallucinations. If they eat it too much, they will undoubtedly be deeply fascinated by it. This guy, who was essentially a demon from the lower realm, showed such a sincere smile for the first time since he came to the Ash World. However, what he said next made the trade caravan, who had a glimmer of willingness to sacrifice their wealth to save their lives, completely give up hope. I'm sorry, but the moon candy is not on the same route as mine. Therefore, your role now is no different from what I expected. As he spoke, Wugulu, who was disguised as a desert elf, pulled out the scimitar in the scabbard at his waist and walked to the trade caravan members who were hung in a row. You're tuning in to the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.